Hello everyone, I'm the DreamTeller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never thought retiring at 55 would lead me to a dark corner of my own house. It happened last month, right after I made the decision to fix up the place by myself. I thought it would be a simple project. Just tear out some old materials, patch a few holes, and slap on new paint. But after I pulled down that ancient ceiling in the hallway, I saw a crack in the wall near the corner. It wasn't large. It looked more like a thin slit. I shined a flashlight on it. There was a faint buzzing sound coming from inside, like a faraway hum. At first, I figured it might be some kind of electrical wiring. I decided to investigate it later. But that same night, when I was finishing up, I heard a voice. It was a low, choked sound, like a whisper that got stuck halfway out of someone's throat. I want to be clear about what I heard. It wasn't a word. It didn't sound like a moan or a breath. It was somewhere in between. My first instinct was to check if someone had entered the house, but I was alone. I had locked all the doors and I kept the windows shut to keep the dust out. I walked through every room with a hammer in my hand, flipping on lights, checking closets, even looking behind furniture. Nothing. No sign of a break-in. No sign of another person. I went back to the hallway and stood there in front of that crack. The buzzing noise was softer now, almost like it got quieter when I came near. I pressed my ear against the wall. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel a slight vibration under my palm. I felt a draft of cool air on my neck. But everything around me was closed. I didn't see any open vents. There was no wind outside that night. I told myself that air might be coming from the attic or some gap in the old ducts. I didn't believe myself, but I needed an explanation to stay calm. I slept badly that night. I kept replaying that whispered sound in my head. I had dreams about hidden rooms and someone trying to speak but never getting the words out. I woke up covered in sweat. The next morning, I told myself I was just tired from all the work. I got up, drank coffee, and tried to approach the day like it was any other project. I took my tools back to the hallway. I planned to widen that slit a bit to see if there was any mold or water damage inside. I tapped the drywall with a small hammer. The buzzing kicked up again. It felt like it responded to the tapping. My stomach dropped when I realized it wasn't coming from any wiring. It was coming from a specific spot, like something was behind the wall. I hesitated for a moment. I decided to put down a tarp and carefully cut out a small piece of drywall around the slit. I figured I could always patch it later. I placed the blade of my utility knife against the drywall and started cutting. The sound got louder, then stopped all at once. It was like someone turned off a switch. My hand shook a bit, but I kept going. After removing a section the size of a shoebox, I shined my flashlight inside. I saw nothing but darkness. I tried to reach in, but the gap was too narrow. The flashlight's beam didn't reveal any wires or pipes or anything else. I poked around with the end of a screwdriver, feeling for a stud or maybe a broken piece of lath. I heard a faint scrape of metal on wood, but that was it. There was no insulation in that part of the wall, just empty space that seemed deeper than I expected. After a while, I patched the hole and moved on. I told myself I'd check the rest of the house for structural issues. I thought maybe I'd call a contractor in the morning to get a second opinion, but I never made that call. That evening, I decided to work a bit more before bed. The hallway was quiet. I felt a chill as soon as I stepped into it, even though it was late summer and still warm outside. The new patch on the wall looked normal. I tapped it. No response. I kept my distance. There was a sense of pressure in the room, like the air was heavier than usual. I carried on, removing some loose boards from a corner near the floor. I wanted to see if the subfloor was rotten. It was around 9 at night, and the house felt oppressive. My skin felt clammy, like I couldn't cool down even with the fan on. I started to hear that buzzing again. It cut through the silence, even though it was quiet. I leaned back, turned off my work light, and stood there in the dark. I listened. The buzz rose and fell, kind of like a slow pulse. Then I heard the whisper. It was louder this time. I froze. My chest tightened, and my breathing grew shallow. The voice sounded choked again, like it was coming from someone who couldn't breathe. I stepped closer to the patched section. My fingers tingled. There was a sensation of cold on my left shoulder, like someone brushed ice against it. I whirled around, shining my flashlight behind me. Nothing was there. I said something like, "Who's here?" Or maybe I just mouthed it. My voice felt stuck in my throat. I glanced at the windows. They were sealed shut with plastic. There was no chance of a breeze. I didn't hear footsteps or movement, just that low voice. It faded after a few seconds, then the buzzing stopped. I stood there for a while, breathing hard and gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles hurt. I decided to leave the tools where they were and go to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept jolting awake, feeling like someone was leaning over me. Around 2 a.m, I went back to check the hallway. I don't know why. Something compelled me to make sure everything was all right. I walked in, turned on the overhead light, and stared at the wall. The patch job looked fine. I didn't hear anything unusual. I waited, leaning against the opposite wall, arms crossed. After about 5 minutes, I felt that cold breeze on my shoulder again. My entire body tensed up. My hair stood on end. I walked back to my bedroom, locked the door, and stayed under the covers until morning. Over the next few days, I tried to carry on with the renovation. I concentrated on painting other rooms, installing new door frames, and replacing some light fixtures. But every time I went near that hallway, I felt uneasy. The buzzing would start up again at random times. Sometimes it was so soft I almost doubted my own hearing. Other times it was strong enough to make the drywall vibrate. I could feel it through the handle of my screwdriver. I tried to record the sound with my phone. When I played the recording, I only heard static. I kept listening for the whisper. I never managed to capture it, but it happened at least 3 more times. Each time, my body reacted the same way. Shaky hands, dry mouth, a tightness in my chest. My eyes watered, and I felt my pulse hammering in my head. I tried different things. I opened all the windows. I set up a box fan to circulate air. I checked the fuse box to see if some circuit was causing an electrical issue. Nothing changed. One evening, I decided to open up a larger section of the wall. I put on safety goggles and gloves. I laid down plastic sheets and used a drywall saw to cut a big rectangle around the patch I'd made. I wanted to see if there was an animal nest or some old wiring. As soon as I started sawing, the buzzing got louder. My stomach knotted up. My hands were slick with sweat, but I kept going. After pulling out a section about 3 feet wide, I peered inside with a bright flashlight. I saw wood beams, some old nails, and a dark cavity that seemed to go behind the adjacent room. The air inside felt cold on my face. My eyes stung for a moment. I stuck my head in a bit to get a better angle. The smell was musty, like damp wood. I didn't see any signs of rodents or insects. I lifted my flashlight, scanning the narrow space. The beam fell on what looked like an old piece of cloth or maybe wallpaper. It was bunched up against a crossbeam. I reached in with a gloved hand and tried to pull it out, but it was stuck. I yanked harder, and it came free with a sharp ripping sound. I held it up to the light. It was just a scrap of fabric, possibly from some old curtain or an old shirt. It had a faded pattern on it, but I couldn't tell what. It was dusty and smelled of mold. I dropped it on the plastic sheet. Right then, the whisper came back louder than before. It was right near my ear, and it made my eyes tear up. My heart raced. I scrambled to get out of that hole. I banged my shoulder on the edge of the drywall. The whisper faded into a wet, cough-like sound. My legs felt shaky, but I pushed myself up and backed away from the wall. My flashlight shook in my hand, and I had trouble catching my breath. The cold air hit me again, this time brushing across my neck. I jerked around, shining the light in every direction. There was nothing there. I stood there, panting for a good minute. Then I shoved the drywall section back in place, grabbed my tools, and left the hallway. I spent the rest of that night in the living room with the TV on. I barely paid attention to the programs. I just needed noise to distract me. My thoughts kept drifting to that whisper. It sounded like someone trying to warn me about something, but I couldn't pick out any words. I kept thinking about that cold breeze and the way it touched my shoulder and neck. It felt like fingers made of ice. For the next week, I avoided that hallway at night. I worked there only in the morning and early afternoon. The sounds didn't happen during the day, or if they did, I didn't notice them over the noise of my tools. I managed to seal that gap with new drywall and insulation, but I kept feeling anxious. The house didn't feel welcoming anymore. I heard small creaks and groans all the time. I jumped whenever the phone rang or the floor squeaked. My stomach was in knots and I lost my appetite. On the final day of that week, I decided I'd had enough. I gathered the supplies to replace the entire ceiling in the hallway, hoping I could close off that strange cavity. I got my ladder, my drywall panels, nails, and everything else. Around 6 in the evening, I started removing the remaining old boards overhead. The debris kept falling around me, and dust filled the air. I wore a respirator, so it was hard to breathe, but at least the dust didn't choke me. The old boards creaked as I pried them loose. Then, right when I was about to pull the last board down, I heard the whisper again. This time it was close to my ear, almost like a real person was behind me. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I heard it in my ears. Sweat dripped down my face. I forced myself to finish prying the board off. Dust rained down, and I heard that buzzing surge once more. It vibrated through the ladder. My arms felt weak and I almost dropped the crowbar, but I powered through, yanking the board free. It tumbled to the floor with a loud crash. I climbed down and moved back toward the wall, expecting the whisper to intensify, but it was silent. I glanced at the open cavity in the ceiling. It looked empty. The buzzing stopped as quickly as it started. I hauled out the debris, tossed it in the dumpster outside, and returned to measure and cut the new drywall. My hands shook while I worked. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to feel that cold touch on my skin again. I finished putting the new panels up around 10 at night. I taped and mudded the seams, then gathered my tools. My muscles ached, and my head throbbed from tension. I waited in the hallway for a few minutes, just listening. Nothing happened. The house was silent. I felt relief for the first time in days. I cleaned up, locked the doors, and double-checked the windows. Then I went to bed. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for any sign of that voice or that buzzing. The house remained quiet. I still felt uneasy, but my eyes grew heavy. Eventually, I fell asleep. Over the next few days, I kept busy with other parts of the renovation, always cautious when I passed that hallway. I still felt a slight draft sometimes, like the air was never completely still, but I didn't hear the buzzing or the whisper again. Now, I'm still in the house, finishing the last bits of the renovation. The memory of that crack in the wall lingers in my mind. I haven't told anyone about the whisper because I'm not sure if they'd believe me. I wonder if I disturbed something when I tore out that ceiling. I still get a cold chill on my shoulder sometimes, but I pretend it's just my imagination. I've decided to stay here. I don't want to run from my own home. If I ever hear that voice again, I'll stand my ground. But every night, before I turn off the lights, I pause at the hallway and hold my breath. I watch and listen. So far, it's stayed quiet, but I'll never forget the sound of that choked whisper and that icy breeze on my skin. I can't explain it, and I guess I never will. I still remember the stale smell when I walked into that abandoned photo studio. The floorboards creaked under my boots. Dust floated in the beams of light slipping through the boarded-up windows. Everything seemed stuck in time. I had expected an empty room with broken gear, but I found something else. I found rows of cameras on shelves, film canisters scattered on a table, and negatives hanging from a line near the back. At first, I felt excited. I love analog photography. and the chance to explore an old studio felt like a gift. But as soon as I noticed those hooded silhouettes in the negatives, my stomach turned. It still does when I think about it. I'm a 35-year-old guy who's been shooting with film cameras for a decade. I learned it from my uncle, but I got hooked on the process myself. Developing film in a darkroom relaxes me. I like the smell of chemicals and the slow reveal of the pictures in the tray. I like the tactility of it all. When I heard about this studio, I drove over on a Friday afternoon. It was on the edge of town, tucked between a boarded-up bookstore and a vacant restaurant. The front door was locked, so I walked around the side and found a broken window. It was big enough for me to crawl through. I got inside and landed on a dusty floor. My heart pounded, but I was more curious than nervous. The front room looked like a reception area. There was a counter with an old telephone and a stack of yellowed receipts. Chairs lined the walls, their upholstery ripped and sagging. I noticed a strong smell of mold. I also noticed how quiet it was in there. No traffic sounds, no wind, just my own breath. I stepped past the counter and moved to a door that led into the actual studio space. That's when I noticed all the equipment. There were light stands, tripods, and big old umbrellas for flash photography. Everything looked like it had been sitting there for at least 10 or 15 years. Spiderwebs covered the corners. My boots left footprints in the dust. I remember feeling a wave of excitement at the thought of rummaging around for vintage cameras or maybe some old film stock. Then I saw a row of negatives hanging near the back wall. The negatives were clipped to a thin wire, the kind used in dark rooms. They looked old but not ancient, maybe from the 90s or early 2000s. They were curled at the edges, and a little bit of light from a broken window shone through them. I took a few careful steps closer, trying not to disturb anything. The floor squeaked under me. When I held the first negative up against the light, I saw a figure in a hooded cloak. I couldn't see a face, just the dark shape of a head and shoulders, with that hood draped around it. The figure stood in what looked like a large room. The more I looked, the more it reminded me of the very studio I was standing in. The background had a similar shape, like the same high ceilings and corner lights, but I shrugged it off at first. I thought maybe it was a shot from some old shoot with a costumed model. I moved to the next negative. The same hooded figure was there, still in some corner of the frame. It looked closer. Not a lot, but enough that I felt a small pinch in my gut. I swallowed hard, then moved on. The third negative showed the figure again, but now it was almost in the center. By the fourth, it was larger and clearer. Every time I moved to the next strip, it felt like the figure had taken a step closer in that sequence of images. My hands started to shake a bit. I wiped my palms on my jeans and leaned in to see if I was just imagining it. The moment I realized I wasn't imagining it, a chill ran through my neck and shoulders. My breath felt tight. I heard my heart beating in my ears. I decided to check all the negatives in order. I hoped I'd see some explanation, like a staged photo series. But the more I looked, the more it felt like it was inching closer. Eventually, in one of the last strips, the figure was close enough that I could see the outline of its face. But the face was blacked out or covered by a shadow. I couldn't see any details. It was just blank darkness under the hood. I dropped that strip on the table and took a step back. My pulse was racing. I felt a sensation of pressure in my chest. My mouth was dry. I tried to calm down. I told myself it was just an odd series of photos. Maybe the photographer was experimenting with some horror concept. But something about the environment gave me a bad feeling. I turned around and scanned the room for any sign of actual people. The place was silent. The dust was thick. I felt alone, but not completely. I reached for my flashlight in my backpack and clicked it on. The beam cut through the shadows in the corners. I didn't see anyone, just old equipment. A few boxes were piled near a door that might have led to a closet or dark room. I forced myself to approach the negatives again. I wanted to examine them more systematically. I saw the same hooded figure in each shot, always in the studio. The position changed in ways that made my skin crawl. It looked like the figure was literally moving across the frames, coming closer with every shot. I thought about turning around and leaving, but something made me keep looking. Curiosity can be strong, even when fear is gnawing at you. I swallowed and decided to check the rest of the studio. I figured I might find a logbook or an old calendar that explained who used to work here. Maybe there was a label on the negatives or some developer's notes. I walked around, scanning the floor and the shelves. I found a small closet near the back. Inside there were bottles of developer, fixer, and a few other chemicals. Most were dried up or leaking. The smell was bitter and sharp. The overhead light didn't work, so I used my flashlight. I opened a small wooden drawer and found some scribbled notes, but they were faded. I couldn't read them. I tried to hold them up to the light, but the words were almost gone. There was a closed door that seemed to lead to a dark room. I could tell by the thick black drapes around the edges. I pushed it open and stepped inside. My nostrils filled with that familiar chemical smell, but stronger. It made my eyes water. There was a red safe light mounted on the ceiling, but it was off. I swung my flashlight around. The counters were covered with trays, beakers, and a few boxes of photographic paper. A line of negative strips hung along one wall. Most of them were empty or so old they were just dried up film. A few seemed exposed. I moved closer, and that's when my heart skipped a beat. I recognized a shape in one of the strips. It was that same hooded figure. I clenched my jaw and felt sweat gathering on my forehead. I didn't want to keep looking, but I felt drawn to it. I lifted the strip with 2 fingers and squinted under my flashlight. The hooded figure was there, standing in the same studio space. My hands shook and I almost dropped the film. Then I heard a faint sound behind me. It was like a small shuffle of feet or maybe a piece of equipment shifting. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the room. Everything was still. My heart pounded and my temples throbbed. I tried to breathe quietly, but I ended up panting. The air felt thick. I left the dark room and walked back into the main studio space. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stared at the negatives on the line again, and I felt a sudden urge to see if anything had changed. I stepped closer and examined the frames. They looked the same, but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. My stomach felt tight, and my mouth was still bone dry. I glanced around the room for a sign of movement or a shadow that shouldn't be there. The windows were boarded up, so the only real light source was my flashlight and a few cracks in the planks. I tried to shake off the paranoia. Then I spotted a small table near the back with a couple of old cameras on it. They were dusty and had some film still inside. I decided to check them for more clues. I walked over, picked up one of the cameras, and carefully rewound the film. I popped open the back, pulled out the roll, and held it in my hand. The label was faded, so I couldn't tell exactly what brand it was. I thought maybe I could develop it at home, but I felt uneasy about doing that. Still, curiosity won out. I slipped the roll into my backpack. It might hold answers, or at least confirm who shot these images. My hands were still trembling, so I wiped them on my jacket. I heard another creak from somewhere. It could have been the old building settling, but every noise made me jump. I decided I'd had enough. The place felt oppressive. I started heading back to the window I came in through. I kept my flashlight on, sweeping it left and right. I wanted to see every corner before I took another step. My pulse was racing and my scalp tingled like I was expecting something to jump out at me. I even called out, "Hello?" But my voice echoed with no reply. The silence felt heavy. When I reached the window, I hesitated. A part of me wanted to go back and grab those negatives, but another part of me never wanted to see them again. My flashlight flickered for a moment, which made my heart skip. I tapped it and the beam steadied. I climbed onto the window ledge. Shards of glass stuck out of the frame. I carefully lifted one leg through, then the other. I stepped onto the sidewalk outside. The sun was starting to dip behind the buildings and the street was empty. I took a deep breath and realized I'd been sweating. I stood there for a moment, gathering my thoughts. I could still feel my heart thudding and I felt a chill on my skin despite the warm air. I walked to my car and got in, locking the doors. I stared at the studio building for a moment. It looked so ordinary from outside, just another closed business. But inside it felt different. I started the engine and drove off. During the ride home, I kept replaying the images in my mind. That hooded figure, the way it seemed to get closer in each frame. I tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was a creepy photo shoot, but my gut told me something else was going on. Once I got home, I went straight to my own dark room in the basement. I kicked off my boots and dropped my backpack on the floor. I felt like I needed to check the roll of film I'd found, but I also felt dread. My skin felt clammy. My breath was uneven. I knew if I developed it, I might see more of that figure, maybe even worse images. But I couldn't help myself. I felt compelled to know. I pulled out the roll and laid it on the table. My hands were unsteady. I set up my chemicals and turned off the main light, flicking on the red safe light. I began the process of developing, working with muscle memory. All I could think about was that hooded silhouette. When I finally hung the negatives to dry, I realized it would take a while before I could view them properly. I had to wait. The waiting made me restless. I paced around the basement, checking my phone and running my hand through my hair. My heart rate wouldn't slow down. I kept imagining that figure in the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to calm myself by thinking about camera brands or shutter speeds, anything, but my mind kept drifting back to that studio. After the film dried, I used my loupe to look at the frames. My chest tightened as soon as I saw the first image. It was a picture of the same studio floor, partially out of focus. Then there was a shot of a light stand, another shot of the corner with some boxes. And then, in the last few frames, there it was, that hooded figure. It was almost at the center of the frame, standing among the equipment. In the final shot, it looked like it was facing the camera, but the hood covered everything. My throat felt tight. My eyes burned from staring so hard. I felt my knees weaken. I pulled back from the desk and sank into my chair. My hands were clammy. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I glanced around my basement darkroom, half expecting to see something in the corner. There was nothing but my shelves of gear and the chemical trays. I exhaled and rubbed my face. I couldn't think of a reason why these photos existed. I had never seen anything like this before. I decided I wasn't going back to that studio alone. I didn't know if I'd tell anyone what I saw, who would believe me. But I knew I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. I kept thinking about those negatives, still hanging there in the abandoned place. The figure felt too real. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. I took a shower, but I kept my bathroom door open so I could see the hallway. I kept picturing that hooded silhouette standing behind me. I tried to sleep, but every noise made my chest tighten again. My mind kept going back to those images, to the sense that it was getting closer. I had never felt that kind of lingering tension before. Eventually, I drifted off. The next day, I woke up with a headache. I spent most of that morning avoiding my dark room. I didn't want to look at the negatives again, but I knew I couldn't avoid them forever. They were the only proof I had of what I saw, and they made my whole body tense up whenever I thought about them. Around noon, I went downstairs and checked them one last time. The hooded figure looked exactly as it had the night before. It wasn't just in my imagination. Those frames were real. I'm telling this story because I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me out of that studio. I don't have proof of anything supernatural, but I have the negatives. I see that figure every time I hold them up to the light. I can't explain it, and I don't know if I ever will. But I do know one thing. I'm never developing abandoned film without a second thought again. If anyone ever asks me why, I'll tell them about that hooded silhouette and how it felt like it was moving from frame to frame, getting closer each time until it was right there looking at me. And that's all I can handle. I'm done. I parked my truck on the gravel shoulder and stepped out. The air felt cool on my face and the ground under my boots felt loose. I glanced around and didn't see any passing cars or people. The place looked deserted. An old sign stuck out of the dirt on the side of the broken road. The letters were faded, but I could still read something about a detour. I was here to photograph a decommissioned stretch of highway for a small local project. I'd been asked to capture the condition of the road and any structures left behind. I didn't expect to find anything interesting, just cracked asphalt and maybe some crumbling guardrails. But then, I saw the bridge. It stood about half a mile ahead, rising over a narrow ravine. The metal beams looked intact from where I stood. No rust ate through the sides in any obvious spots. The concrete pillars appeared steady, holding up the deck with no sign of collapse. It seemed odd. Most old bridges on abandoned roads around here had obvious damage or missing parts. This one looked almost new, but there were no tire marks leading up to it. Weeds had grown over the edges, covering what used to be a wide shoulder. There wasn't even graffiti on the railings. It looked unused, like someone just placed it here and then forgot about it. I slung my camera over my shoulder and walked toward the structure. Each step crunched on loose gravel, and the wind kicked up dust around my ankles. I listened for birds or insects. The area stayed quiet. My pulse felt a little faster, but I told myself it was just the excitement of finding something unexpected. I moved closer, noticing the details of the bridge. The railings were metal with small gaps between the posts. The floor was solid concrete with a slight dip in the middle. The surface had a thin layer of dirt and pebbles. A few shallow cracks stretched across, but nothing that seemed dangerous. I wanted to get a shot from one side, capturing the entire span and the ravine below. I squatted near a cluster of weeds and raised my camera. My viewfinder revealed the silent structure ahead. The sky overhead was a dull gray, giving everything a washed-out look. I snapped a few photos, adjusting the shutter speed to capture the dim light. I could see the shape of the ravine under the bridge. It dropped about 20 feet with a narrow trickle of water at the bottom. Loose rocks lined the banks. I took a few more shots from different angles. The place felt too still. I decided I should cross the bridge to get more pictures from the other side. I walked up to the entrance. My boots touched the edge of the concrete and I paused. Something about the silence bothered me. Usually there's some ambient noise, bird calls, leaves rustling, something. But I only heard wind passing over the ravine. My gut tightened a bit, but I brushed it off. I stepped onto the bridge and started walking slowly. My footsteps rang out against the concrete. I felt a slight vibration under my soles, but the structure seemed solid. As I reached the midpoint, I noticed something else. There was an echo. My footsteps echoed in a sharp, hollow way. But there was another sound that seemed to match my steps exactly. It came right after my own footfalls, as if somebody behind me stepped in the same spots at the same pace. My chest felt tight, and I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I looked over my shoulder and saw no one. The railing behind me was empty. I stared for a few seconds and waited. No movement, no person. The air around me felt cool, and my arms prickled with goosebumps. I told myself it was just the echo bouncing off the ravine walls. I forced myself to keep going. I took another step and the echo followed in perfect rhythm. Step, step. I moved faster. Step, 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 step. The matching sound stayed with me. It felt like someone imitating my exact movements. My mouth went dry. I pressed my tongue against my teeth and tried not to panic. I was almost at the far side of the bridge. I told myself it was just the acoustics. Maybe the shape of the ravine caused a weird echo. I reached the end and stepped onto solid ground. Dirt and grass greeted me. The echo stopped. My legs felt shaky and my palms were damp. I wiped them on my jeans and breathed slowly. I turned around to look back across the span. My heart thumped hard in my chest. The bridge looked the same, just an empty structure, but something flickered near the midpoint. It was like a dark shape shifting across the railing, but there was no one there. My skin tingled. My scalp felt tight. I squinted, trying to see details. There was nothing to focus on. It was just a vague shadow sliding across the beams. I blinked. The shape moved again. I stepped back, feeling my heartbeat hammer in my ears. I swallowed hard and lifted my camera. My hands shook a little as I zoomed in. I tried to frame the center of the bridge, hoping to see if there was a person. All I saw was a slight distortion, like when heat rises off a highway in summer, but the air was cool. I pressed the shutter button and took a few shots. My breath was uneven and my fingers felt numb. I lowered the camera and waited. The shape vanished, and I saw plain concrete and rust-colored metal again. I decided I needed more evidence. Maybe I could walk back halfway and see if there was some trick of the light. My legs felt stiff, but I managed to climb back onto the bridge. I walked slowly, listening. This time I didn't hear footsteps that matched mine. I heard the usual creaks of an old structure. My boots scuffed the concrete, and I paused around the midpoint right where I thought I saw the shadow. I leaned over the railing and looked down. I saw the thin stream of water far below. I heard the wind whistle. I noticed a small cluster of rocks to the right, but no one was there. I turned around and looked back toward the far side where I had parked. My truck was just a faint shape in the distance. It was still alone on the roadside. No other cars had arrived. I swallowed again, my mouth still dry. I didn't see any footprints besides my own in the thin layer of dust. The only tracks were mine, heading both ways. The air felt heavier, like there was a pressure on my shoulders. I checked behind me once more, and saw nothing. I returned to the far side near my truck and stood by the entrance of the bridge, breathing hard. I decided to go down the slope under the bridge to see if there was something hanging or some structure that could cause weird echoes or shapes. The ravine slanted steeply, but there were a few footholds and clusters of brush I could use for support. I held on to the metal guardrail at the edge of the road, then lowered myself onto a small ledge of dirt. My boots slipped, sending small rocks tumbling down. I steadied myself with one hand against the slope. My arm shook from tension. I moved slowly, sliding down bit by bit. When I reached the bottom, the air felt damp. The trickle of water sounded louder up close. The underside of the bridge loomed above me. The concrete beams intersected in a grid pattern. I didn't see anything unusual. No ropes, no hidden structures, no sign of recent repairs. Everything looked old and unused. I walked along the shallow water, stepping on stones to keep my feet from getting soaked. My boots sank into wet gravel a few times. I craned my neck to look up at the beams. Spiders had built webs, and there were small patches of mold. I couldn't see any reason for that odd echo. The place looked normal, just abandoned. I heard a small sound behind me, like pebbles shifting. I spun around fast, my hands clenched into fists. A couple of loose rocks rolled down from the slope, kicked by the wind or maybe just gravity. Nothing else moved. My pulse pounded in my temples. I glanced left and right, then forced myself to exhale slowly. I finished a quick inspection of the underside of the bridge. I snapped a few more photos, though my hands were still shaky. Then I climbed back up the slope, slipping once on loose dirt and scraping my palm on a rock. It stung, and I saw a thin line of blood appear. I grimaced and wiped it on my jeans. Back on the road, I felt a wave of relief. I looked at the bridge again. It appeared the same, silent and abandoned. I thought maybe my mind had played tricks on me, triggered by the isolation and the strange echo. I decided to keep working. I had a job to finish. I took a few steps closer and started walking across the bridge one more time, just to get additional shots from various angles. My heart still raced a bit, but I tried to focus on the camera settings, the composition, the frames I needed. As I reached the middle, I heard footsteps again. They matched mine, step for step. My spine tingled and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I tried to keep moving, my boots felt heavy. Each time my foot landed, I heard an echo that didn't sound like a normal echo. It sounded like an actual set of boots on concrete. My stomach tightened, and I pushed forward. When I got close to the far side, the footsteps faded. I let out a loud breath. The tension in my chest made it hard to breathe normally. I reached solid ground again and turned around. I saw a shadow near the midpoint. It looked dark and shaped like a person, but I couldn't see any features. It moved along the railing, Then it slipped behind one of the metal beams and disappeared. My hands trembled on the camera, and I lifted it automatically. I snapped 3 quick photos. My breath was shaky and my heart thumped. The shadow was gone by the time I lowered the camera. I gripped the railing, leaning forward to see if it hid behind a post. There was nothing. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. My legs were stiff. My mind raced with questions, but I tried to stay calm. I walked back a few steps onto the bridge, my camera ready. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too loud in the silence. Nobody answered. My voice echoed off the metal beams. I walked a little farther, expecting to see that shape again. The surface under my feet felt solid, but each step made me flinch. I reached the spot where I thought I saw the shadow. The air felt colder. My arms tingled. I looked around, then checked under the railing. I found only empty space and the drop-off to the ravine. My breathing was quick and shallow. I felt a wave of anxiety and stepped back, afraid to linger in that spot. I decided I had enough photos and enough of this place. My nerves were shot. I turned around and headed back across. I tried to keep my eyes forward. When I neared the side where my truck was parked, my pace quickened. My boots stomped harder, and the matching echo stomped along with me. It got louder. It felt like it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. A shudder went through me. My entire body felt tense, like I was bracing for a blow. I rushed to the end, jumped off the bridge deck, and spun around. The footsteps stopped. The bridge stood empty, but a shadow moved along the left railing. I saw it drift behind one of the beams. My throat tightened. My grip on the camera felt slick with sweat. I stared, waiting for the shadow to appear again. I didn't see it. I didn't hear any movement, just the whistling wind and my heavy breathing. I backed away until my legs bumped against the trunk of my truck. I opened the door with clumsy fingers and tossed my camera onto the passenger seat. I scanned the area one last time, scanning the entire length of the bridge. Still nothing. I felt short of breath and wiped my forehead with my sleeve. I stepped around to the driver's side, got in, and slammed the door. My hands shook as I put the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. I turned the wheel and pulled onto the gravel, heading away from the bridge. I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The structure looked empty. The metal beams glinted dully under the gray light. Then, for a brief second, I thought I saw a dark outline standing at the entrance. My chest tightened again and I tore my eyes away, focusing on the road ahead. As I drove, the tension in my body started to ease, but my heartbeat stayed rapid. My hands gripped the wheel, and I kept checking my mirrors. The road was a mess of cracks and weeds, so I had to steer around potholes. There were no other vehicles in sight. After a few minutes, I reached a gate that looked rusted and half-broken. I slipped through it and found the main highway. Cars rushed by in the distance, and I could hear normal traffic noise again. I pulled over on the shoulder for a moment and cut the engine. My breathing still felt shaky, and my shirt clung to my back with sweat. I felt confused and unsettled. I'd never experienced anything like that. But I had photos. I could check them later to see if I captured that strange shape or if it was a trick of the light. I planned to send the pictures to the folks who asked for them, but I wasn't sure how to explain what I saw. My mind replayed the footsteps matching mine, the sense of being followed, and the sight of that moving shadow. I rubbed my eyes. My pulse was still racing. I took a few deep breaths to steady myself. I started the truck again and merged into traffic, heading home. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale and tense. I told myself it was just an old abandoned spot with some acoustic oddities and weird lighting. But my body remembered the feeling of something behind me. I could still feel the cold sweat on my arms. I could still hear those footsteps. My camera bag sat on the passenger seat and I glanced at it every few seconds, wondering what those photos would show. I reached my driveway after a long, tense ride. I stepped out of the truck, locked it, and went inside. I set the camera on my kitchen table and flicked on a lamp. My hands were unsteady as I scrolled through the images. The shots of the bridge looked normal at first, wide shots of the span, some details of the rust and cracks. Then I found the shots I took when I saw that shadow. I zoomed in. At first I saw nothing, just the metal beams and the empty deck. Then, in one frame, I saw a faint dark shape near the railing. It looked like a blurred form. It wasn't a person, but it resembled a figure. My mouth went dry again and my heartbeat sped up. I put the camera down. My skin felt clammy. I couldn't explain it, but the camera had captured something. I left the light on and got a glass of water. My hands shook while I drank. I felt drained, like I'd run a marathon. I realized it was late, and I hadn't eaten, but I didn't feel hungry. I kept picturing that lonely stretch of road and the intact but deserted bridge. I kept hearing those footsteps echoing with mine. I remembered the shadow that moved when there was nobody standing there. I stood by my kitchen window and stared outside at the quiet street. I could see a few porch lights in the distance, some parked cars. It felt normal, safe, but my stomach still churned. My limbs still felt shaky. I closed the curtains and locked the window. Then I sat down at the table again, looking at the camera. I knew I had to send those photos off. But I also knew I'd never see that bridge the same way again. I wondered if I should even go back. My body told me no. I decided I'd send the photos as is and let them figure out the rest. I was done with that place. I didn't want to hear those footsteps behind me ever again. I never expected my own voice to turn against me. That's what happened when I set out to record echoes in an abandoned quarry last week. I wanted a few crisp soundscapes for a personal project. I ended up stumbling into something that makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. I heard about this old quarry from a friend who does outdoor recordings. He said it was big, hollow, and perfect for capturing long echoes. He warned me it was a little eerie. I shrugged it off, thinking I was prepared for anything. I drove out early in the morning, packed with a portable recorder, a shotgun mic, a couple of contact mics, and extra batteries. The sun was still low, casting faint light over everything. The entrance to the quarry was marked by a rusted metal gate. There was a broken lock hanging from the chain. I pushed the gate open and felt the hinges squeak under my hand. I walked in and looked around. The place was silent. All I heard was the crunch of gravel under my boots. The walls were tall slabs of rock. They were steep and pockmarked, as if someone had taken giant bites out of the landscape. There were a few paths snaking around the perimeter, some covered in loose stones. A wide basin stretched out in front of me, full of broken chunks of rock and scattered debris. I decided to start recording near one of the walls. I checked my levels, tested the microphone. My voice echoed back. Testing. Testing. It was a normal echo at first, just a delayed version of my voice. But then I listened more closely. There was a faint distortion underneath it. I thought maybe my equipment was picking up interference. I tested different angles, different distances from the rock. The distortion stayed. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it almost sounded like low murmuring. I told myself it was the wind or some random acoustic effect. I placed a contact mic against one of the rock surfaces. I tapped the stone. The echo came back clean. There was no distortion that time. I exhaled in relief, figuring the shotgun mic just needed some adjustments. I kept moving deeper into the quarry, checking the ground for stability, because I didn't want to twist an ankle on loose gravel. The air felt heavy. My shirt stuck to my back, even though it wasn't that hot. I felt a little uneasy for no specific reason. I spotted an opening to a carved tunnel in the rock face on the far side. It looked dark inside and I hesitated, but I knew it might have interesting acoustics, so I headed in that direction. As I approached, I noticed a slight breeze pushing out from the tunnel. It didn't feel constant. It came in short bursts like small gusts. When I aimed my recorder toward the entrance and made a quick test sound, I heard my voice return in a strange way again. This time the echo wasn't just delayed, it carried a pitch shift, and it faded in and out. I also heard a brief hiss like static, I stood there, frowning, adjusting my gear. I said my name into the mic. Lucas. The echo came back. Lucas. Then I heard something else behind that echo. It was a whisper. Lucas. It overlapped with my voice. I stopped, pulled the headphones off, and glanced around. There was no one there. I put the headphones back on and replayed that last recording. It was the same thing. My name, repeated 3 times if I counted the original plus the echoes. I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. My heartbeat sped up. I told myself it might be a trick of the echo or maybe my mind playing games. I wanted a better sample, so I hit record again. This time I didn't say anything. I just stood there, holding my breath, letting the recorder pick up ambient sound. I heard the faint breeze, my own breathing, and a distant drip of water. Then something brushed across the microphone input like a soft whisper. I heard a shape of a word, though I couldn't make it out. I replayed it 3 times, but it was too quiet to decipher. I walked into the tunnel entrance, shining a small flashlight on the walls. They were damp in some places and covered in a layer of dust in others. Old mining equipment was scattered around, broken rails and bits of cable. A few supports lined the walls, but they looked worn. I set my gear bag down and tried a few claps, checking the echo profile. The returns were short. Still, I noticed that faint distortion. It made my recording sound off, like there was an extra layer beneath the clap. It reminded me of muffled speech, but I couldn't make out words. I decided to head back outside to explore more of the quarry. I felt uneasy in that tunnel, like something was hovering just out of sight. Outside, I circled around the basin, looking for a better spot. The ground sloped downward in some places, and I saw clusters of boulders that formed narrow passages. The sunlight was bright, but it felt weak inside those passages, as if the quarry walls were swallowing it. I set up near a large rock formation. I laid a contact mic on a flat surface and tapped a few rhythms. The echo repeated them, but I kept hearing that subtle distortion in the background. I took a step back to listen carefully. That was when a gust of wind kicked up from somewhere behind me. It carried a swirl of dust that spun around my ankles and rose up. For a second, it formed a vague outline in front of me. The shape was about the height of a person. It seemed to shift and move as the dust swirled. Then it collapsed back onto the ground. I stared at that spot, breathing hard. My chest felt tight. I glanced around, expecting to see someone, or at least hear something, but I only heard my own breathing. I walked around, checking if there was any gap in the rocks that might explain the sudden wind. I didn't see any. The air was still after that gust. It was almost suffocating. I felt sweat on my forehead, and my stomach churned a bit. I pulled out a water bottle and drank. The water tasted stale, even though I had filled the bottle that morning. I coughed, trying to get rid of the dryness in my throat. I started to wonder if I should leave. I was alone, feeling jumpy. But I hadn't captured the clear echo samples I wanted yet, and part of me refused to give up. I decided to explore a little further, toward the back corner of the quarry. As I walked, I looked up. The walls seemed to tower even higher, and I noticed old rope ladders hanging from a ledge. They looked rotten and half buried under rocks. The entire place felt lifeless. No birds, no insects. Just me. I found another opening that led to a smaller side chamber. It wasn't as deep as the tunnel, but it was dark enough that I needed my flashlight again. I walked inside, my boots scraping over loose stone. I set the recorder on a flat rock and pressed record. Then I said, "Hello?" in a low voice. The echo returned. "Hello?" followed by a soft hiss. I played it back. I heard my voice, the echo, then something that sounded like breathing. I leaned in, focusing. I heard that whisper again. "Lucas." The hair on my arm stood up. I couldn't ignore the tension in my gut. I stepped out of that chamber and headed back to the central basin. I wasn't sure what was going on, but it felt wrong to linger. Still, I wanted more proof. I thought maybe if I captured something unmistakable, I could analyze it at home. So I decided to do one final test in the open basin. I placed the recorder on a small tripod, facing a tall wall. I moved about 20 feet back and spoke at a normal volume. "This is Lucas. Final test." The echo bounced off the wall. "Lucas. Final test." I waited. For a few seconds, there was nothing else. Then a gust of wind blew, but this time it was stronger. It stung my eyes with dust. I shielded my face with my arm. When I looked up, dust was swirling in a circle about 10 feet away. The swirl outlined a tall, thin figure for a moment. Then it dispersed. My pulse pounded in my ears. My mouth went dry. I felt a tremor in my legs. I walked over to the recorder and pressed stop. I played it back right away. I heard my voice, then the echo. Right after the echo, there was a breathy sigh. Then my name repeated twice, like a layer slipping in and out of sync. It was the clearest I had heard it all day. I muttered a curse under my breath, heart hammering. I stuffed my gear back into my bag, checking to make sure I hadn't dropped anything. The place felt too quiet after that gust died down. The air was motionless, but I could still feel a lingering electric sensation on my skin. I started heading toward the exit, my eyes darting to every corner, half expecting to see that dust figure again. My boots kicked loose gravel, and the sound echoed oddly. It almost felt like footsteps following me, but whenever I stopped, the echo did too. Each time that happened, my chest tightened. When I reached the rusted gate, I paused to catch my breath. I leaned against a chunk of concrete by the entrance. My hands were shaking a little. I forced myself to take slow breaths. Then I heard a faint whisper close by. It was the same soft voice saying my name. I looked around. No one was there. I couldn't see any movement in the quarry behind me. I grabbed my bag and walked quickly to my car. I opened the trunk, tossed my equipment in, and slammed it shut. As soon as I got in the driver's seat, I locked the doors out of instinct. My heart was racing. I turned the key and the engine started right away. I pulled out onto the main road, glancing at the rearview mirror. The quarry entrance shrank behind me. My mind kept replaying those echoes and that dusty outline. My throat felt tight, and I kept swallowing, trying to stay calm. I drove for about 10 minutes without turning on the radio. I was too keyed up to listen to anything. Finally, I pulled over at a small clearing by the side of the road, wanting to check my recordings on a better headphone set. I plugged my better headphones into the recorder and queued up the last file. I heard my voice, the echo, then that layered whisper. It was still there, even clearer with the higher quality headphones. My name repeated twice, then a soft exhale. The tone felt unnatural. I could hear tension in that whisper, like it was straining to say my name. I yanked the headphones off. I sat there, breathing hard, hand gripping the steering wheel. My mind was racing. I stared at the recorder as if it might explain itself, but there was nothing else to do. I carefully packed it away and got back on the road. My mouth felt sour. I kept swallowing, but it didn't go away. My hands felt clammy on the wheel. I just wanted to get home. That night, I offloaded the recordings onto my computer. I listened to them in my home studio, where I usually do my editing. I played them at a lower volume because I felt on edge. Each file had that same distortion, though it varied. Some files had that sigh. Some had a faint rush of static. 3 of them had that whisper of my name. When I isolated the frequencies, I noticed a strange pattern in the waveforms. There was a series of short bursts, almost like knocks, then a pause, then a whisper. When I tried to enhance the whisper, it sounded rough, not quite human. I turned the volume down again. I didn't want to hear it too loudly. I gave up on analyzing them that night. I was too tense, and the air in my apartment felt stuffy. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I left the project for the next day. Sleep was restless. I kept picturing that swirling dust forming a shape in front of me. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that faint voice calling me from the darkness. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird acoustic effect in an abandoned quarry, maybe some air pockets or random echoes. But deep down, I felt like I'd experienced something else. I forced myself to go for a short walk, clear my head. When I got back, I powered on my computer again, determined to take another look. But as soon as I opened the audio files, my chest tightened. I didn't want to press play. I sat there, hand on the mouse, thinking about how I felt inside the quarry. My body had reacted in a real, physical way. My heart had pounded. My skin had gone cold. That was more than just curiosity. It was raw fear. After a moment, I closed the software without listening again. I decided to store the files on an external drive and set them aside. I'm not sure when I'll go back to that quarry. Part of me wants to return with better gear, maybe with a friend or two to see if I can reproduce those echoes or find an explanation. But another part of me wants to forget the place entirely. I keep remembering the dust swirling into that shape and the sound of my name layered over my own echo. I didn't see anyone else there, and I didn't see any signs of other people. That whisper felt personal. It felt directed at me. For now, I'm leaving those recordings alone. I don't know what I captured, and I don't know why it felt so hostile. All I know is that something in that quarry gave me the worst chills of my life. I don't scare easily, but when I heard my name echo back at me in those layered whispers, I realized I might have crossed a line. Sometimes we go looking for unique sounds without thinking about what might be waiting in the silence. I swung the front door open and stepped into the hallway. A stale smell hit my nose right away, like old salt and rotting wood. Everything felt wrong. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the dim light from the single overhead bulb flickered in a jittery pattern. I looked around and realized I was alone in a place that had been left for too long. But I couldn't turn back. This was the house I inherited, the one people in my family rarely talked about. Now it belonged to me, and I had no idea what waited inside. I kicked the door shut and set my duffel bag on the worn-out rug. A thin layer of dust covered the floor. My shoes left footprints with each step. The walls were covered in yellowed wallpaper that peeled at the edges. I heard a strange groan from somewhere above, like wood twisting in the wind. My heart pounded in my chest, and I wiped sweat from my forehead. It wasn't even hot, but my nerves were on edge. The quiet felt heavy, like I was waiting for something to jump out at me. The lawyer had handed me a key and a weathered envelope with a note. The place needs work. Watch the doors. It seemed like a joke, but I remembered it when I moved down the hall. Each door I passed squeaked, even though I didn't touch them. It was almost like they were shifting on their own, inch by inch. My mind kept imagining someone on the other side, gently pushing it open and letting it swing back. Every time I heard that squeak, I stopped and stared, but I never saw anyone. The tension built in my chest, and I couldn't relax. I looked inside the living room. There was no furniture except for an old couch that sagged in the middle. The cushions were torn, and scraps of stuffing clung to the springs. A broken TV stood near a corner coated in dust. The windows faced the shoreline, but thick curtains blocked out most of the light. I felt drawn to the windows, so I pulled a curtain aside. I saw the dark beach outside and the faint outline of waves rolling in. The air felt damp, even indoors, and my nostrils twitched with the smell of the tide. I tried to breathe slowly and remind myself this was my house now, even if it didn't feel like it. I headed toward the staircase at the end of the hallway. The steps were solid enough, but each one creaked under my weight. At the top, there were 3 rooms and a small closet. Every door had a tarnished brass knob. I pressed my ear to each door before opening it. The first room was empty, with a small window overlooking a side yard. The second was a bedroom with a large bed frame, no mattress. It smelled moldy, and I noticed a thick stain on the wooden floor under the bed frame, but I didn't stay long enough to figure out what it was. The third room was locked, and the knob wouldn't budge. I tried pushing it a little, then gave it a hard shove with my shoulder. The door barely moved. The squeaking sound I had heard downstairs started again, as if the door was mocking my attempt to get inside. I felt my pulse quicken. I stepped away and decided to deal with it later. Right then, I just wanted to find a spot where I could sit and think. I remembered there was a basement. The lawyer had mentioned something about old junk down there. I found the door to the basement near the kitchen. It was a plain wooden door with rust around the hinges. When I turned the knob, I expected resistance, but it opened right away. A dark staircase disappeared into blackness below. A musty odor drifted up. I flipped a switch on the wall and a single bare bulb flickered to life, revealing concrete steps and damp walls. I started down slowly. I got about halfway before I smelled something worse than the musty air. It was like wet metal and mildew combined. My stomach churned. I forced myself to keep going. The bulb's light was weak, so I kept my hand on the wall to steady myself. My fingers felt slimy residue. I tried to wipe it off on my jeans, but it left a sticky smear. At the bottom of the steps, there was a wide room with a low ceiling. Boxes were stacked along the walls. A few old chairs were scattered around. Then I heard a faint rattle, like metal on metal. I froze and listened. It sounded like chains dragging across the floor, but I couldn't see where it came from. I noticed a door to the right. It had a heavy padlock that was covered in rust. The chain around it looked old and discolored, and I wondered if that was the source of the sound. I walked closer and nudged the chain with my foot. It made a dull rattle but didn't match the earlier sound. My heart thumped in my ears. I couldn't tell if something else was inside that room or if I was just imagining things. The walls here felt wet to the touch, with dark streaks running down toward the floor. I leaned in and saw long, narrow scratches in the stone. They cut deep, maybe half an inch. They looked like claw marks, but no animal I knew could cut into stone like that. I shivered. A sudden crash made me jump. I spun around and saw a small wooden box had toppled off a stack. Its contents spilled across the floor. Old tools, nails, and a hammer. My hands shook and I forced myself to breathe slowly. I told myself it was just unsteady stacking, but I felt watched. My neck prickled. I picked up the hammer, deciding it could serve as some kind of weapon if I needed one. Another rattling sound came from behind the locked door. I stepped closer. A trickle of water dripped from overhead, hitting my shoulder. The cold droplets made me flinch. My instincts told me to go back upstairs. I listened to that feeling. I rushed up the basement steps, taking 2 at a time. I locked the basement door behind me and leaned against it. My heart pounded, and my hand tightened around the hammer. My throat felt dry, so I moved to the kitchen sink. I turned the faucet, but only a bit of rusty water trickled out. I let it run until it cleared, then filled a glass. The cold water tasted metallic, and the dryness in my throat didn't go away completely. I realized it was late. The darkness outside felt thick, and the waves outside seemed louder. I decided to pick a room upstairs to spend the night. I didn't want to stay on the first floor with that basement door so close. It might have been paranoia, but I couldn't shake it. I grabbed my duffel bag from the hallway and went back upstairs to the bedroom with the empty bed frame. I didn't like the idea of sleeping on the floor, but I had a sleeping bag in my duffel. I rolled it out in the corner, away from the stained spot. I locked the bedroom door and wedged a chair under the knob for extra measure. As I lay there, I felt every fiber of my body tense. My ears were on high alert for the slightest noise. Around midnight, the door started squeaking again. It was the same slow, drawn-out sound. Sometimes it came from down the hall, sometimes from below. Each time my heart raced and I clutched the hammer. I tried to ignore it, but every hour or so the noise returned. The house felt alive, shifting and moaning like an old hull in rough waters. I barely slept. When I finally dozed off, I had a jolt of fear around 3 in the morning. That chain rattle echoed through the halls. My eyes flew open, and I listened. It sounded like it came from the basement again, but it was louder this time. I stayed still, forcing my breathing to remain quiet. A part of me wanted to race out of the house and never look back. But I fought that urge. I was alone, and no one was here to help me. My skin prickled, and my chest felt tight, but I managed to remain still until the rattling stopped. By morning, I had slept maybe an hour. My muscles felt stiff, and my mind was fuzzy. I got up and removed the chair from under the doorknob. I opened the bedroom door. The hallway air felt stale, but I didn't smell anything foul. A bit of daylight trickled through a cracked window at the end of the corridor. I checked the other door again, the locked one. I pressed my ear to it and tapped lightly with my knuckles. I heard a faint scraping from inside, but it might have been my imagination. My stomach growled, so I went downstairs. In the kitchen, I found a can of coffee in a cupboard. It was sealed, so I figured it might be okay. There was a rusted kettle on the stove, but the stove wasn't hooked up to anything. I ended up boiling water in a small pot I found under the sink. The coffee tasted stale, but at least it was warm. It gave me a small burst of energy. After that, I rummaged through the cupboards and found some dry crackers. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but I forced them down. I decided to check the other rooms on the first floor more carefully. One looked like a small library or study, with empty bookshelves that had some scattered papers and a few broken picture frames. I flipped through the papers, but most were just old receipts or blank pages that had turned yellow over time. Another room was a large dining area, but it had no table, no chairs, just a thick layer of dust. The windows in that room were boarded up from the outside, which blocked out most of the daylight. I wondered why anyone would board up windows in a dining room. The day passed slowly. I repaired a couple of doors that hung crooked on their hinges. I tested the faucet in the bathroom and managed to get a weak flow of water. It was cold, but it was better than nothing. As I worked, I kept hearing those squeaks, though less frequently than during the night. Each time I paused, hoping to catch someone in the act of moving a door, but I never found anything. The emptiness of the house made me uneasy. By late afternoon, I told myself I had to face the basement again. I needed to see if there was a leak or some broken pipe causing that rattling. I took a flashlight and the hammer. The stairs creaked even louder than before. When I reached the bottom, the light revealed water dripping along the walls, forming puddles. I heard the distant sound of water running through pipes. Maybe the house's plumbing was in worse shape than I realized. I turned toward the locked door again. I aimed the flashlight at the lock. The rust looked thick, but I thought maybe I could break it if I hit it hard enough. I set the flashlight on a nearby box, tightened my grip on the hammer, and took a swing at the padlock. The clang echoed through the basement. My arms vibrated from the impact, but the lock held. I tried again with more force. This time, the padlock cracked, and the chain fell to the ground with a sharp clatter. My pulse raced. The door nudged open a few inches, releasing a dank smell that made me gag. I pushed the door wider and shone the flashlight inside. The walls were covered in the same wet stains, but here they were darker. Small puddles had formed in the corners. The floor looked like old concrete, cracked in several places. There was a large metal ring set into the far wall, with a piece of broken chain attached. It might have been used to tie something up. My stomach tightened at the thought. I stepped inside. The room was empty except for a table with rusted metal parts on top. I leaned in and saw what looked like nails, bolts, and a twisted piece of piping. On the floor, I noticed more claw marks in the concrete. They looked deeper here, and some overlapped, forming odd patterns. The air felt thick, and my breath sounded loud in my ears. My heart drummed in my chest, and my hands felt clammy around the hammer's handle. Then I heard it again, a metallic scraping as if someone dragged chains across concrete. It sounded close. I spun around, but there was no one behind me. I stepped back toward the door, my heart pounding. The flashlight flickered once, and I felt panic rising. I tried to steady it, tapping the handle. The beam held. The scraping sound stopped. The room was still. My hands shook, and I realized I was gripping the hammer so tightly that my knuckles hurt. I moved to the corner of the room, checking for hidden doors or vents. There was nothing but damp concrete. I ran my hand across one of the claw marks. The edges were rough, and my fingertips felt gritty. It took some effort to pull my hand away. That's when I noticed the faint outline of footprints on the floor leading toward the metal ring. They were the size of a person's feet, but the edges were smudged, like they had been dragged. My throat tightened, and my mouth went dry. I backed away, not sure what to do. I felt a drop of water land on my wrist. I looked up and saw moisture collecting on the ceiling. Tiny droplets formed and fell in slow intervals. Each drop echoed in the silence. That chain rattle echoed again, this time from somewhere above. I stared at the open door, struggling to keep my focus. My mind conjured images of someone or something lurking in the house, dragging chains and scratching the walls. My chest felt tight, and I wanted to run. But I forced myself to walk calmly back to the basement stairs. I moved one step at a time with the hammer raised. My breathing was shaky, and the sweat on my forehead felt cold. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and slid the deadbolt in place. Then I pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it. My arms trembled as I did this, and I felt drained. I didn't know what was in that basement, but I didn't want it getting upstairs. My stomach turned at the idea of spending another night here, but I had nowhere else to go. This was my house now, like it or not. It felt like a prison more than a home. I forced myself to eat a quick meal of leftover crackers and some jerky I had in my bag. I washed it down with lukewarm tap water. Every swallow felt like a chore. I avoided looking at the door to the basement. I kept glancing at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was an old analog clock with a second hand that ticked loudly. I realized how the ticking matched my heartbeat. Night fell again, and I found myself in the living room, staring at the boarded windows. The wind outside picked up, and I heard the ocean surge against the shore. The squeaking doors started again, one after the other in a slow, repetitive cycle. I paced the living room, my arms tingling with nervous energy. At some point, I heard a faint tapping sound from the ceiling. I looked up, not sure if it came from the attic or the second floor. The tapping stopped, then the chain rattling returned, muffled behind the basement door. My mind buzzed with questions. I felt sweat trickle down the back of my neck. I decided I wouldn't sleep upstairs. I pulled the couch cushions to the floor and formed a makeshift bed in the living room. I kept my flashlight and hammer at my side. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. I lay there, listening to the house creak. The repeated squeaks of doors opening on their own never stopped. Each time I pictured someone pushing them. I closed my eyes, but every little noise jolted me back to alertness. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light sleep. My dreams were scattered fragments of wet walls and scraping claws. I woke up sweating, with my hands clenched around the hammer. I listened for a while. The squeaking had paused. The chain rattling was silent. It was just before dawn, and a thin line of pale light peeked through a gap in the window boards. I slowly got up and stretched. My muscles protested, sore from tension. The musty smell was worse than ever. I thought about what to do next. Maybe I would call a contractor or someone who could help figure out these structural problems. Maybe the strange noises had a logical explanation. I was still freaked out, but I wasn't ready to give up. My head throbbed from lack of sleep. I just knew I couldn't keep going like this. I had to find a way to fix the house, or at least make it safe. I was determined to do something about those squeaking doors, the rattling chain, and whatever was down in the basement. So I stood there, breathing in stale air, ready to face another day in this lonely house by the sea. I was on my way home after a long day. The main road was closed because of some construction, so I took a side road that ran parallel to the highway. It was late, and I had the headlights on high beam because there were no streetlights. The pavement was cracked, and I had to steer around small potholes every few yards. That's when I saw it. An old pedestrian underpass entrance on my right, half hidden by tall grass and a broken metal railing. I felt an itch in my gut. Something about that tunnel called to me, and I decided to stop and check it out. I was tired, but my curiosity was stronger than my urge to get home. I parked on the gravel shoulder. My car's engine clicked as it cooled in the night air. The wind was light, but it carried the scent of damp dirt and some kind of musty odor. I grabbed a small flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out. My shoes crunched on the loose gravel, and I glanced around to make sure no one was on the road. There wasn't a single car in sight. I walked toward the underpass entrance, stepping over patches of weeds that poked through the cracked concrete. The opening was framed by old metal bars that might have once held a gate. Now they were rusty and bent. The walls leading into the tunnel were covered in graffiti. Most of it was faded, the colors washed out by time. I shone my flashlight across a few random tags. Some had dates from the early 2000s, others from who knows when. I couldn't make out names or words, just letters that had bled into each other. The tunnel looked dark. The overhead lights were old tube fixtures, some flickering or completely dead. Water dripped from somewhere, echoing off the walls. The sound bounced around in an uneven rhythm. I took a breath and stepped inside. The air was thick, like it had been trapped for years. I could smell mildew, maybe mold. My footsteps sounded louder than normal, each step clapping against the cold floor. I noticed my steps had a slight echo, but after a second or two, the echo seemed to come back at an odd delay. It made me think someone else was walking behind me, just out of sight. I stopped and turned around. No one was there. I waited, letting the silence press on my ears. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel my pulse in my neck. My eyes scanned the entrance, the beam of the flashlight sweeping from one wall to the other. Old flyers peeled away from the bricks. Everything was still. I moved farther in. The graffiti got denser, and the tags were layered on top of each other. Some were older than I'd ever seen, with thick lines and bubble letters that looked like they belonged to a different era. A small puddle spread across one part of the floor. I stepped around it, not wanting to soak my shoes. The dripping noise got louder. As I walked, I noticed overhead lights spaced at intervals along the ceiling. Most were dead, but a couple still flickered, casting a weak yellowish glow. Every time a light flickered, I saw my shadow jump across the wall. I tried to keep my focus forward, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. That echo-like sound of footsteps still nagged at my brain. It felt like whenever I took a step, something else took a step half a second later. But every time I turned around, the tunnel was empty. My flashlight beam started to shake because my hand was getting tense. I squeezed the flashlight tighter. I told myself it was just an echo. These old tunnels have strange acoustics, and my imagination was messing with me. I pushed on. A short distance ahead, I saw a bigger set of graffiti that looked more like a mural. It had a mix of shapes, some kind of letters or numbers, but they were faded beyond recognition. The paint had chipped in spots, revealing cracked concrete underneath. The piece might have been impressive back in the day, but now it looked like a ghost of someone's art. I stood there for a moment, trying to decipher anything from it. I heard the steady drip of water again, and then my own footsteps as I shifted my weight. And then I heard a second set of footsteps. They were faint, like someone was stepping lightly, but they were there. I spun around and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. The light beam cut through the stale air. The walls looked the same. There was no one behind me. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. The tunnel was cool, so it wasn't the heat. It was pure nerves. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed. I waited. No response. I walked faster. I wanted to see what was on the other side of the tunnel, maybe an exit. It was supposed to connect two sides of the road, but I wasn't sure. The structure looked old, and I wondered if the other side was blocked off or collapsed. My footsteps slapped the floor in a steady rhythm, and I heard that faint imitation behind me again. It was lighter, like someone was barefoot or wearing softer shoes. I stopped again, and the sound stopped too. "Is someone there?" I said, louder this time. My voice came back at me in echoes. I felt my chest tighten. The flickering lights ahead made me squint. For a second, everything went dark when the overhead tube went out completely. Then it flickered back on, casting a pale, sickly glow. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the flashlight's reach, there was a shape. It looked like a person standing still. I froze, and my breath caught in my throat. The figure's outline was all I could see. It didn't move. I couldn't see its face or clothes. It just stood there, staring in my direction. I could feel my pulse thudding in my temples. I lifted the flashlight to get a better look, but the overhead light flickered again. And in that split second of darkness, the figure vanished. When the light came back, there was nothing there. Just the damp walls and the old graffiti. I felt a chill run down my arms. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I took a few steps forward, shining the flashlight from side to side, looking for any hint of a person. There was no movement, no sound, nothing. I tried to control my breathing and think straight. Maybe I had imagined it. My eyes could be playing tricks because of the flickering lights. But something inside me said that wasn't true. I'd seen someone, or something, standing there, and it was gone now. I pressed on, faster. My steps echoed in a quick rhythm, and that strange, delayed echo followed, always half a beat behind. Every time I passed under a functioning light, I saw my own shadow jerk and then vanish. The next light would be dead, and I'd have to rely on my flashlight again. The tunnel felt longer than it should have. I started to think I should turn back, but I wanted to find the exit, to prove to myself this was just an old underpass and nothing more. I reached a point in the tunnel where the walls seemed narrower. The graffiti there was more recent, with fresh paint and brighter colors. The smell of spray paint clung to the air. A piece of the floor was uneven, and I nearly tripped. I cursed under my breath and braced a hand against the wall to steady myself. The concrete felt damp and gritty. I wiped my hand on my pants and kept going. I saw another flicker ahead and then darkness. The overhead light popped and fizzled out. My flashlight beam wavered over chipped bricks and leftover garbage, crushed cans, an old magazine, and something that looked like a shoe. The shoe was missing laces. I saw no sign of the figure. My body was on edge, my muscles tight. Then I heard a faint scrape behind me. My stomach lurched. I spun around, pointing the flashlight back the way I came. The beam landed on the spot where I'd been seconds before. I saw wet footprints that didn't match my shoe size. They were smaller, maybe from a lighter shoe. Each print was a little behind where I had walked. That meant someone had stepped where I stepped, but only after I moved on. I felt sweat break out on my palms. My heart thumped hard against my ribs. I waited, flashlight held out, scanning back and forth. No one was visible. My mind raced. Could it be a trick of the water from the ceiling? Maybe droplets formed shapes that looked like footprints. But the prints were too defined, and they lined up too neatly. I felt a wave of unease course through my chest. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice sounded shaky. Silence. Just the drip of water and the electric buzz of a dying light fixture. I pivoted and kept moving forward, picking up my pace. My heart was hammering, and my legs felt tense. My flashlight bobbed with each stride, throwing jumping shadows on the walls. The distant end of the tunnel was dark. I couldn't see an exit, but I hoped there was one. After several more steps, the tunnel opened up a bit. The ceiling got higher and there were fewer lights. I could see a faint glow from what I guessed might be the other entrance or maybe a streetlight outside. The floor sloped upward. I felt a small rush of relief. If there was an exit, I could get out and circle back to my car from the outside. Maybe I'd have to walk around a fence or some brush, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be done with this place. Then the overhead lights flickered again all at once. For a moment, everything was illuminated in that dull, yellowish glow. My flashlight seemed useless. I blinked, adjusting to the sudden light. That's when I saw the figure again, straight ahead, halfway between me and the possible exit. It stood still, facing me. The face was in shadow, but I could make out a body shape that suggested a man, or at least an adult. I felt my stomach tighten. My scalp prickled. I raised the flashlight. The figure didn't move. The lights above flickered. In the next instant, the figure was gone again. I heard a rustle, like fabric brushing against concrete, then nothing. My mouth felt dry. My breathing was shallow. My skin felt clammy. I forced myself to walk forward. I thought about calling the police, but my phone was in my pocket, and I didn't want to stop to dial. I just wanted to leave. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon. Each step felt heavy, like I was moving through thick water. I heard a scraping sound from the ceiling. I tilted my head up and aimed the flashlight. There was just some exposed wiring, a broken panel, and a pipe. Nothing else. I scanned around, but I didn't see the figure. My ears were tuned to every small noise. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Finally, I reached a part of the tunnel where I could see an opening above me. It looked like a broken gate that led out to the sidewalk on the other side of the main road. The gate was bent, and a short set of concrete steps led up to it. Light from a distant street lamp filtered in, giving the area a faint glow. I climbed the steps and pushed on the gate. It creaked but held. I leaned into it harder, and it gave way with a loud groan. I squeezed through the opening and stepped onto a small patch of cracked pavement. Weeds grew in clusters. I turned around to look back into the tunnel. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The overhead lights had settled into a low flicker. The graffiti-covered walls looked warped under the uneven light. I thought I saw movement near the base of the steps, but I couldn't tell for sure. I decided I wasn't going back to check. My legs shook as I walked away. The sidewalk was barely maintained, with big chunks missing. I followed it until I reached a side street. I recognized the general area. My car was on the other side of the underpass near the original entrance. I'd have to circle around on foot. I hugged the street lamp's glow for a moment, just catching my breath. The air outside smelled fresher, but my clothes felt damp from the tunnel's moisture. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure behind me on the sidewalk. Nothing. The night was still. A few scattered windows in the distance showed faint lights. No people out walking, no cars coming by. I started walking again, my pace quick. My mind replayed what happened in the tunnel. The footprints, the echoing steps, that figure vanishing in the flicker of the lights. I kept checking behind me, making sure no one was following. I finally made it back to my car, approaching it from the opposite side of the road. It was still parked where I left it, illuminated by the glow of my headlights. I felt a rush of relief. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and locked everything behind me. My heart was still pounding, and my palms were slippery on the steering wheel. I turned the key. The engine coughed to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The tunnel's entrance was off to the side, partially blocked by weeds and a rusted fence post. It looked silent and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just inside, watching me. I flicked on the radio, more for noise than anything else. I backed up carefully, trying not to let my imagination run wild. As I pulled onto the road, I caught one last glimpse of the underpass in my side mirror. There was a small flash of movement, or maybe it was just a shadow cast by my taillights. Then it vanished. I pressed the gas and left that place behind. My body remained tense, adrenaline still surging. I drove home with my eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds. My mind kept returning to that shape in the tunnel and how it disappeared the moment I tried to see it clearly. When I reached my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, engine idling, headlights shining on my garage door. My chest rose and fell with every rapid breath. I felt a tightness in my stomach, but I was away from that place. I was safe for now. I killed the engine and got out, locking the door behind me. The air here smelled cleaner, quieter. I went inside and tossed my keys on the kitchen counter. My shirt stuck to my back, sweat dried to my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. Had I imagined it? The footprints were real, though. The shape was real. The echoing footsteps were real. My head felt cloudy and my muscles were still on edge. I decided to leave it alone for the night. I walked to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the water run hot. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot, my hair a mess. I stepped under the water, trying to wash away that stale, musty feeling that clung to me, but it stayed in my nose and on my skin, no matter how much soap I used. Eventually, I got out, dried off, and went to bed. I lay there listening to the quiet hum of the house. Every small creak made my heart skip. I kept picturing that figure, standing in the tunnel, waiting for me to notice it. Then it was gone, leaving only footprints behind. I didn't sleep much. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head. My body refused to relax. My thoughts bounced between fear and confusion. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. But even then, I dreamed of wet concrete, flickering lights, and the sound of someone following just a few steps behind. I stepped into that old foundry on a Tuesday morning, expecting stale air and years of neglect. The first thing that hit me was the smell of fresh oil. It caught me off guard. I stood there in the entryway, holding my tool bag, trying to make sense of that smell. My flashlight beam showed me rusted walls and exposed wires. The ceiling was full of broken light fixtures. I heard the soft drip of water somewhere behind a wall panel. My instructions were simple: evaluate the condition of the machines for a potential buyer. I wasn't prepared for the uneasy feeling that spread through my gut the moment I walked in. I walked down the main corridor, keeping my flashlight low. The concrete floor felt damp under my boots. My footsteps echoed, and my breath sounded too loud in my ears. I tried a few light switches, but nothing turned on. At first I thought maybe there was still some electricity flowing, but there was no hum, no flicker, just darkness. Outside, light barely reached in through the high windows. I saw dust motes drifting in the weak beams of sun, but the air smelled heavier than simple dust. It smelled like old grease and something sharp like metal shavings. Under that, I still caught whiffs of fresh oil. I found a stack of steel racks leaning against a wall. They had old labels. I swiped my finger across one. Thick grime coated my glove. That grime told me nobody had touched those racks in a long time, but the smell of new oil still lingered in the air, and it was strong. I turned around to scan the corridor, hoping to see a workbench or some sign of recent activity. The corridor was empty, and the only sound was my own breathing. I moved on, heading deeper into the main workshop area. A row of massive machines filled the space. They looked like giant stamping presses, caked with rust on the outside. My job was to document their condition, so I knelt by the nearest press and inspected the control panel. The switches were stiff. My flashlight revealed chipped paint and rust flakes. There were no visible signs of someone messing with them. Yet that smell of oil grew stronger. It clung to my nostrils, a sharp reminder that something in here had been maintained, or at least touched, in the last few days. I stood up and glanced around. There was a series of steel shelves against the far wall. They held various spare parts like gears and old bearings. At the end of the shelves, I noticed a pair of gloves. They were half hidden behind a toolbox. My flashlight caught a faint gleam of moisture on the fabric. I stepped closer and prodded them with my own glove. They were damp. I didn't see any water dripping from the ceiling there, so it made no sense. They felt like they'd been used recently and then tossed aside. That discovery rattled me. I was supposed to be alone in this foundry. The place had been shut down for months, according to the site manager. Nobody had any reason to come in here. Still, I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that sometimes squatters sneak into abandoned buildings. Maybe someone had been fixing something to sell for scrap. Or maybe the manager was wrong about how long this place had been closed. My eyes drifted around the shelves and I listened. The space was too quiet. My heart thumped in my chest. I took a slow breath and swallowed hard. Then I continued with my inspection. I made my way to the next area, which was a separate workshop full of metal lathes. A few overhead lights hung crookedly from the ceiling. I tried to move quietly, but every footstep seemed to echo. My flashlight beam jumped from one machine to another. Each lathe looked old and neglected. Layers of rust and dust clung to the metal surfaces. At one point, I checked a lathe's lubrication system. The line was dry, but the reservoir smelled like somebody had topped it off recently. It wasn't a strong smell, but it was enough to unsettle me. A sudden metallic clank made me freeze. It came from somewhere behind a row of cabinets. I turned off my flashlight and held my breath. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. I waited, heart pounding. I heard a soft shuffle, maybe a footstep or a piece of metal brushing against concrete. Then silence. I didn't know if I should call out or stay quiet. The foundry's emptiness weighed on me, and my skin tingled with anxiety. After a few moments, I switched my flashlight back on. I forced myself to move in the direction of that sound. My pulse quickened, and I found my mouth was dry. My boots scuffed the floor, and I tried not to trip over the bits of metal scrap scattered around. I peered around the cabinet, but there was no one there. The only thing I saw was a half-open drawer stuffed with worn-out wrenches and bolts. I clenched my jaw and stepped back. I told myself it might have been something shifting on its own. Old buildings make noises, I reminded myself. I continued with my inspection, but I kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. My stomach felt tight, and a bead of sweat trickled down the side of my face. I found another pair of machines in a corner. They looked like ancient milling machines. I bent down to check the serial numbers on their sides. My flashlight was the only light in that area, and the darkness pressed in around me. The air was thick and stale, except for that lingering hint of oil. My fingers shook a little as I scribbled notes. Something moved on the other side of the machine. At first, I thought it was a shadow from my own flashlight. Then I realized it was a person. Tall, with a lean build, wearing some sort of dark jacket. I couldn't see the face, but I definitely saw movement. I froze. My flashlight beam swung in that direction, and the figure stepped back behind the shelf. I heard a quick shuffle, then nothing. I stared, trying to see if they would come back. My pulse thundered in my ears. I swallowed and took a shaky step forward. "Hello?" I said, my voice echoing off the walls. No answer. I inched around the side of the milling machine. The figure was gone. A tall set of shelves stood against the wall loaded with random parts and boxes. It would be easy for someone to slip away behind them. My flashlight caught a glimpse of footprints in the dust. They looked fresh. I knelt to get a closer look. They were larger than my own boot prints, which unsettled me more. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't some random squatter looking for scrap. Somebody was watching me. Somebody who knew their way around this place. I decided to finish up in that section and move toward the back of the foundry. I wanted to get a look at the biggest machines in the facility. A large overhead crane hung from the ceiling tracks. It looked corroded. Rust stained the chains and hooks. I took notes on my clipboard, but my hands wouldn't stay steady. I kept imagining that figure lurking behind me. I forced myself to check each part of the crane assembly. The metal support columns were solid but covered in flaking paint. I spotted a pail of grease under one column. It looked new with a clean label. The pail was open and the grease on top looked fresh. The lid was tossed to the side. I stared at that pail. My heartbeat thudded faster. Someone had been greasing something here. This wasn't leftover from years ago. The color was bright and the consistency looked undisturbed except for one scoop taken out. I was about to take a closer look when I heard another noise. It sounded like a low scraping coming from the walkway above. I pointed my flashlight upward. There was a metal catwalk near the ceiling, rusted and missing sections of railing. I caught a flicker of movement up there. I thought I saw a hand gripping the rail. Then it disappeared. This time I felt my fight-or-flight response kick in. My arms felt tense. My heart hammered. My throat felt tight. I didn't know if this person was hostile or just avoiding me. Either way, it felt wrong. I told myself I would do my job, document what I needed, and get out. I had no desire to confront whoever was up there, but I also didn't want them creeping around behind me. I headed toward the final section of the foundry, a large storage area in the back. It was separated from the main workshop by a sliding metal door. The door was partially open, and the interior was dark. I shone my flashlight inside. Rows of shelving units stood from floor to ceiling. I saw crates of spare parts, coils of wire, random tools scattered around. Some shelves were almost empty. The ones in the back looked packed with metal cylinders and old boxes of screws. The air smelled stale. My boots kicked up dust with every step. Water dripped from a busted pipe overhead, creating a small puddle near the center aisle. I walked slowly, scanning the shelves. My flashlight caught more footprints on the floor. They circled around the shelves in erratic patterns. Some were large, some were smaller. I was on edge. My pulse throbbed in my neck. That fresh oil smell seemed even stronger in here. I heard a faint clang behind me, and I spun around. My flashlight illuminated the corner of a shelf. I saw a slight motion, like a shadow shrinking away. Then silence. The tension built in my chest. My mind raced with questions. Was it one person or more? Why were they hiding? I called out, "I'm just here to inspect the machines. I'm not looking for trouble." My voice sounded uneven. No reply came back. The foundry stayed silent except for dripping water. I forced my legs to move forward. My skin prickled with every step. I reached a cluster of older machines. They looked like compressors of some kind, all lined up in a row. I inspected them quickly. Rust covered their bolts, but I noticed new scratch marks near one of the access panels. The panel itself looked like it had been pried open. That didn't look like normal wear. I heard another scrape from behind me. I jerked around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on the corner of a tall shelving unit. For a split second, I saw a figure's head peek out, then vanish. My chest tightened again. The figure was tall, at least a foot taller than me. I saw a flash of pale skin, or maybe a light shirt under a jacket. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I took a few steps in that direction, but I heard a quick rustling and then nothing. I stood there, heart pounding, uncertain what to do. Every instinct told me to leave, but I had a job to finish. If I reported that I saw someone, my boss would ask questions. He'd want proof. I took a breath, focusing on keeping my voice steady. "Hey, I'm not the police or anything. I just want to do my inspection." No response. The darkness felt oppressive. My nerves were shot and my palms were sweaty. I told myself I'd do a quick final pass and then get the hell out. I did a rapid check of the rest of the storage area. My flashlight bounced across old engine parts, bins of bearings, random spare valves. Some looked normal with dust and rust. Others looked used or at least touched recently. I spotted a few small puddles of what looked like spilled oil. They couldn't have been old because the liquid still glistened under the flashlight. In one corner, there was a half-empty bottle of water. It had condensation on it. That meant it was fresh from somewhere cold. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was definitely using this place as a workshop or hideout. A clang echoed from the far end of the storage area. It sounded like metal slamming against metal. My stomach twisted. I spun around, nearly dropping my flashlight. The sound reverberated, and I could feel a tremor in the concrete floor. I took a few cautious steps in that direction. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but part of me needed to see what was going on. My flashlight swept across the final row of shelves. A large steel door at the end of the aisle was open a crack, letting in a faint glow from outside. I smelled cool air drifting in. That must have been some sort of side exit. A sudden flicker of movement at the door caught my eye. The tall figure stepped into view, backlit by the dim light outside. The person paused and looked over a shoulder, but I couldn't see the face clearly. My heart hammered. I stood still, my flashlight shining on the door. The figure lingered for 1/10 second, then slipped out into the outside yard. The door banged shut. My body felt rigid. My breathing came in short bursts. I realized I was alone again. Whoever that was seemed to have left. I rushed to the door and tried to pull it open. It was locked from the outside. I put my ear to the metal and listened. I heard nothing. I felt trapped and relieved at the same time. Maybe that was the only person lurking around, and now they were gone. I took a moment to calm down. My legs felt shaky, and my hands were clammy. I realized I'd done enough of an inspection. I had notes on the machines. I had photos on my phone. There was no reason to stay. I hurried back through the main workshop, scanning the shadows. Each step felt heavy. My throat burned from breathing the stale air. I kept looking behind me, half expecting that figure to reappear. Nothing jumped out. Nothing made a noise. When I reached the main entrance, I saw the sunlight streaming in through the broken windows. I stepped outside and exhaled. My heart rate was still high and my face felt flushed. I walked straight to my truck and tossed my tool bag in the passenger seat. I leaned against the door, taking deep breaths. I still smelled that oil on my jacket. It clung to me, like a reminder of the strange encounter inside. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I glanced back at the foundry building. The walls looked more rusted in the daylight. Part of me wanted to tell the site manager about the figure. Another part of me just wanted to forget it. My job was to inspect the machines, and I had enough data to write up my report. Whoever was in there didn't harm me. They just watched. Maybe they were making use of the old equipment for their own reasons. I decided I'd give a minimal report and recommend more security if the buyer was serious. As I drove off the property, I noticed how quiet the road was. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But I didn't see anything unusual. The tension in my shoulders gradually eased. My thoughts raced with what I'd tell my boss. I wasn't sure if he'd believe I saw someone in there, but I knew what I saw. Fresh oil, wet gloves, footprints that didn't belong to me, and that tall figure slipping around in the shadows. I finally pulled onto the main road. The foundry's outline disappeared behind me. My pulse began to settle, but my mind stayed alert. I'd never been so on edge during a simple inspection job before. There was no telling what that person wanted or why they were hiding. The only thing I knew was that they'd been watching me every step of the way, and they seemed to know the layout better than I did. I kept driving, letting the cool air from the open window blow across my face. The faint odor of oil still clung to my clothes, reminding me of the strange tension inside that old building. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter. By the time I reached the highway, I felt like I'd left a piece of my calm behind. But at least I was out in the open, far from those rusted walls and hidden catwalks. I didn't plan on going back alone. If someone else wanted a more detailed evaluation, they could send a bigger team. I wasn't setting foot in that place by myself again. I heard about this valley from a guy at a local bar. He had a few beers in him and started rambling about old cabins left behind by explorers a long time ago. He mentioned a heavy fog that settles in the area at night, and how some people claim the windows in those cabins shake and rattle without explanation. His words got stuck in my mind, and I figured I needed a break from my routine. So I rented a motorcycle and set out to see if his story held any truth. I arrived at the edge of the valley just after sunrise. The place looked empty. There were a few shrubs and a dirt path leading down a slope. The air felt damp, and the sky looked dull, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just stay cloudy. I parked the bike near a large rock and got off to stretch. My knees were stiff from the ride. My jacket smelled like sweat and dust, but I felt excited. There was a sign at the trailhead warning about sudden fog banks. I remembered what the guy at the bar said, so I took it seriously. I grabbed my small backpack, zipped up my jacket, and started down the path, hoping I'd find these old cabins before the fog rolled in. The path was narrow and uneven. I had to step over rocks and broken branches every few feet. My boots kept slipping on loose gravel. I moved slowly to avoid twisting an ankle. The valley was quiet, except for my footsteps and my breathing. The place felt untouched. I felt a flutter in my stomach, like something wasn't quite right, but I kept walking. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something stuck in the ground. It looked like a broken lantern, the kind you might see in old mining photos. The glass was shattered and the metal handle was bent out of shape. I picked it up for a moment and then set it down. It didn't look safe to carry around, and I didn't want to cut myself. A little farther down the path, I found another lantern also broken. Then another. The pieces were spread out in the dirt, sometimes half buried. They formed a kind of trail. I decided to follow them, figuring they might lead me straight to the cabins. The air got colder as I went deeper into the valley. I could smell damp earth and wet leaves. My fingers felt numb whenever I reached out to steady myself against a rock or a tree. After about an hour of walking, the fog started to settle in. It came on fast, like a sheet being pulled across the sky. Within minutes, I could barely see a few steps ahead. I turned on my flashlight, but the beam struggled to cut through the haze. My heart rate went up because the path was already rough, and now I couldn't see where I was stepping. I tried to stay calm, but my pulse thumped in my ears. Eventually, I spotted the outline of a small structure ahead. The shape looked like a cabin. As I got closer, I saw more details. Wooden walls, a metal roof, and a front porch with 2 steps. The windows looked fogged up from the outside. The wood on the porch was warped and creaked under my weight. I tried the front door and it opened with a shaky push. The hinges let out a high-pitched squeak. Inside, it smelled like stale air and old wood. Dust coated every surface. I closed the door behind me, trying to keep the fog out, but the place still felt damp. I found a lantern on a dusty table near the door. It was old and had a cracked glass chimney, but it still had some oil in it. I took out my lighter and tried to light it. It flickered a few times, then it caught. The small flame gave me a bit of comfort. I walked through the main room. There was a small fireplace against the far wall, a couple of chairs with torn fabric, and a table with a broken leg. The windows were large, but they had these heavy wooden shutters on the outside that hung loose on their hinges. I heard the wind outside, but it sounded muffled by the fog. I placed my backpack on the table and took out a bottle of water. My throat felt raw. I decided to check the other rooms. There was a short hallway with 2 doors on each side. The first door on the left opened into a tiny bedroom. There was a bed frame without a mattress, just some wooden slats covered in dust. A small closet door stood open, revealing empty shelves. No clothes, no shoes, nothing. The second door on that side was stuck, so I gave it a solid push with my shoulder. It opened into a storage room filled with old crates. Most of them were empty. A few had scraps of cloth or metal pieces that looked like parts from lanterns. Everything smelled musty. My nose burned from the stale air. Across the hall, I found another bedroom, similar to the first. The walls had marks where pictures or maps might have hung once. The window here was cracked. A draft blew in, making the hair on my arm stand up. The last door led to a small kitchen area. There was a rusted sink, a wooden counter, and a few old pots and pans scattered around. It didn't look like anyone had cooked there in years. My stomach rumbled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since early morning. I pulled an energy bar out of my backpack and took a few bites. The taste was bland, but I forced it down. By the time I finished checking each room, the light outside had faded. It was only mid-afternoon, but the fog made it seem later. I decided I'd stay in that cabin for the night, or at least until the fog lifted. My chest felt tight, and my skin felt sticky from the humidity. I found a small bundle of old firewood near the fireplace. The pieces were damp, but I placed them in the fireplace and tried to get a small flame going with some crumpled paper I found. It took several tries, but I managed to get a weak fire started. The warmth felt good on my hands. Night fell quickly. The fog outside turned into a thick wall. I could barely see the porch from the window. I placed my sleeping bag on the floor in the main room, near the fireplace, and propped my backpack against the table. The lantern flickered on the table next to me. I settled in, trying to keep my mind off the stories I'd heard. At around 9 or 10 at night, I heard a strange tapping sound on one of the windows. It was faint, almost like a branch scraping against the glass. I got up and walked to the nearest window. I pressed my ear against it, but didn't hear anything else. My heart pounded and my hands started to sweat. I told myself it was probably just the wind. An hour later, the windows started rattling. It wasn't a gentle vibration. It was a hard shake, like someone pushing against them from outside. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I felt a tremor in my chest. My mouth went dry, and I clenched my fists without realizing it. I grabbed the lantern from the table and held it up. I didn't see any shadows outside, just the fog. The rattling kept going on all 3 windows in the main room. I moved toward the one near the fireplace, but as soon as I got close, it stopped. Then the window to my right started shaking again, even harder. I swung around, but I only saw darkness through the glass. My legs felt shaky. I forced myself to open the front door. The cold air rushed in. I held the lantern out, trying to see more than a few feet ahead. The porch was empty. The night was dead silent, but the fog swirled around, making it impossible to see anything in the yard. My breathing sounded loud in my own ears. I stepped forward, letting the lantern light the porch floor. The wood groaned under my weight. I kept waiting for someone or something to pop out, but nothing happened. After a minute, I went back inside and locked the door. The rattling stopped for a while. I sat down near the fireplace, trying to stay calm. My shoulders ached from tension and my head was pounding. I kept telling myself it was just the wind pushing on the shutters. But then I remembered how those shutters were mostly broken. They didn't even look like they could fully close. Something or someone had to be applying real pressure against the glass. I didn't know what to do. I felt stupid for coming here alone. But I also felt too scared to leave in the middle of the night. I decided I'd wait it out until sunrise. I tried to sleep but kept jolting awake whenever I heard the slightest sound. The windows would shake in short bursts. Sometimes I heard a light scraping noise along the outer walls, like nails or branches moving across the wood. Each time my heart thumped so loudly that I felt it in my ears. I gripped the lantern's handle until my knuckles turned white. My body was on high alert, and I felt sweat pooling under my armpits. I tried to tell myself to breathe slowly, but every small creak in the cabin made my nerves spike again. Around what felt like 3 in the morning, the wind outside picked up. The fog never lifted, but I could hear gusts rustling through the trees. The windows pounded a few more times, each one making me flinch. My eyes burned from trying to keep them open. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to a snapping sound in the fireplace. The fire was almost out, and only embers glowed. I got up, my back stiff and my legs cramped. I poked at the embers, hoping to get a bit more warmth. My flashlight batteries were half dead, but I used it to look at my watch. It was around 5 in the morning. I decided to pack my gear. I didn't care if it was dark. I wanted to be ready to leave as soon as there was enough light to see the trail. My stomach growled, but I ignored it. I took a few sips of water and ate another energy bar. While I was packing, I noticed the bedroom doors were ajar. I remembered closing them earlier. I froze for a second, staring at the hallway. My scalp tingled and goosebumps ran down my arms. I walked slowly toward each door, pushing them open with my foot. The rooms were empty, same as before. No footprints, nothing out of place except the doors themselves. I didn't see any reason they would have opened on their own, but I wasn't about to investigate further. I returned to the main room and zipped my backpack. My hands shook a bit from adrenaline. As soon as I saw a hint of gray light through the windows, I headed outside. The fog was still thick, but it wasn't as dark. I could see maybe 10 feet ahead. That was enough for me. I didn't look back at the cabin. I just started walking, following my compass to get back to the path. My boots sank into wet ground, and sometimes I slipped on mossy rocks. My heart was still racing, and every so often I glanced behind me, expecting to see a shape moving in the fog. I heard nothing except my own breathing and the occasional bird call in the distance. It took me longer to find my way out of the valley than it had taken me to get in. The fog messed with my sense of direction. I had to backtrack a few times. My nerves were shot and my limbs felt shaky. Eventually, I recognized the large rock where I'd parked my bike. Relief washed over me. I hurried to the motorcycle, checked my gear, and fired it up. The engine noise sounded like music to my ears after hours of silence and rattling windows. I revved it a few times, trying to shake off the tension in my chest. I rode away from the valley, keeping my eyes on the road. The fog still clung to the hills, but at least I had the bike's headlights now. My mind kept replaying the thumping windows and the sensation that something was right outside. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. By the time I reached a main road, I felt like I had stepped out of a dream. My body was sore and my clothes felt damp and sticky, but I was glad to be out of there. Looking back now, I wish I had brought someone with me. I don't know what was causing the windows to shake, but it felt unnatural. I didn't see any tracks or signs of animals. It didn't feel like a prank either. The force behind those rattles was too strong. Whatever was out there never showed itself, but I felt its presence. I still feel a knot in my stomach when I think about it. For now, I'm staying away from valleys with strange stories attached to them. I got what I came for, an experience I'll never forget, and a reminder that some places are better left alone. I pushed open the broken side door and felt the stale air hit my face right away. Dust rose around my feet and the hinge groaned like it hadn't moved in decades. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and stood still, scanning the old lobby. Dim light from the street outside crept through cracks in the boarded windows, falling across the torn carpet. I could smell mold and old popcorn. I took a slow breath, feeling my heart rate pick up. I don't usually sneak into places, but this cinema had drawn my attention for months. Now that I was inside, I felt a knot in my stomach. I stepped forward, my shoes stuck to parts of the floor. I saw a few overturned chairs by the concession stand. There was a shattered display case that might have once held candy. I ran my fingers over the dusty counter, feeling grains of dirt cling to my skin. The silence in the building was heavy. There wasn't even the sound of traffic from outside, just a vague hum of the wind through broken windows somewhere deeper inside. I spotted a row of old posters along one wall. Most were torn or faded. I recognized one for an 80s action movie. The main actor's face was almost unrecognizable behind water stains and ripped paper. Next to that, there was a poster of a fantasy film from the same decade. The colors were dull, but I could still make out the name. I stepped closer and tried to peel the corner back to see if there was a date. The paper crumbled between my fingertips. I heard a faint rattling noise from somewhere behind the concession stand. My breath caught in my throat for a second. I leaned to the side to check behind the counter, but all I saw was a collapsed shelf and some broken glass. I stayed quiet and listened. No more noises. Maybe it was just the wind. I clenched my fists once, just to work off the tension in my arms. The building felt too quiet, and that made every little sound echo. I walked toward the main hallway that led to the theater rooms. My heart pounded as I moved through the gloom. My phone flashlight cut through the dust in the air, revealing the old patterns on the wall. They looked like they had been bright blue at one point, but now they were just grayish and peeling away. I kicked a loose tile by mistake. The echo that followed made me flinch. It was like being inside a cavern. At the end of the hall, I found double doors that led into the largest auditorium. One door was barely hanging on its hinges. The other was wedged open by a folded seat. I squeezed past it. The smell inside was stronger, a mix of dampness and mildew. I swept my light across the rows of seats. Most of the upholstery had rotted away. Some seats were missing their cushions. I noticed a few soda cups left on the floor. The plastic lids caved in, the straws bent. They looked like they'd been there for years. I walked down the aisle, feeling the carpet squish under my feet. Small bits of trash rustled as I moved. The stage in front of the screen was dusty, and pieces of the screen's bottom edge were peeled back, revealing a black backing behind the white surface. Up above, the screen loomed like a huge blank rectangle. My eyes scanned up to the projection booth window at the back. It was completely dark. I wondered if the projector was still up there, but I'd heard from a friend that it had been taken apart a long time ago. He said the place had closed in the mid-'80s and never reopened. I climbed onto the stage carefully. My shoes left footprints in the thick layer of dust. I turned around to look at the rows of seats from that angle. The theater looked even bigger from up there. The smell of stale popcorn and mold grew stronger when I inhaled. My stomach tightened again, and I felt a bead of sweat on my neck. I wasn't sure why I was sweating. The place was cold. My pulse was faster than normal. My mind kept telling me this was a bad idea, but I didn't turn back. I aimed my phone flashlight at the screen. Tiny holes dotted the surface, the kind they use for movie sound systems. I touched it carefully, rubbing my palm over the rough material. There was a quiet buzzing sound coming from somewhere above me. It made me glance up at the dim ceiling lights. They looked dead. One was flickering faintly, creating a slight strobe effect on the stage. The flicker died out after a few seconds, leaving me in near darkness again. I caught myself tightening my grip on my phone. I decided to check the projection room next. I walked back up the aisle, sidestepping broken seats. I used the side stairs that led up to the narrow hallway behind the theater. At the end, there was a metal door with chipped paint and a small sign that said projection. The handle felt cold. It turned with a loud click, and I pushed the door open. Inside, I smelled old grease and dust. My phone's light showed me a large platform where the projector must have sat. I saw wires sticking out. The main body of the projector was missing, just like I'd heard. A few metal parts were scattered around, including what looked like a lens or mirror assembly. I turned slowly, shining the light around the cramped room. Rows of film reels lined one shelf, but they were covered in rusted metal canisters. Some were labeled with marker, though the words were faded. I ran my finger across one, feeling flakes of rust crumble off. Then I heard a click from somewhere to my left. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. I held my breath and listened. Another click. It sounded like a switch or maybe an old circuit breaker toggling on its own. I took a cautious step in that direction, then paused. The hair on my arms stood up. My palms felt damp. I could see an electrical panel on the wall. The door was open, and some wires looked corroded. I leaned in, but I didn't touch anything. A small red light was glowing on a breaker. That was strange, considering I didn't think the building had any power. I stared at it for a few seconds, then the red light flickered and went dark. My chest felt tight. I inhaled slowly to calm myself. I left the panel alone and moved away, not wanting to mess with old wiring and risk a shock. As I turned to leave, I stepped on something that cracked under my shoe. It was a piece of glass. I saw a broken fuse or bulb on the ground. I walked back into the hallway and headed toward the exit door that led behind the building. It was locked, so I returned to the auditorium. That's when I noticed a faint light dancing across the main screen. It wasn't bright. It was more like a low glow that pulsed every few seconds. My arms tensed, and I stopped at the threshold, keeping myself partly hidden by the doorway. I watched the screen flicker with a dull flash. There shouldn't have been anything projecting onto it. The projector was missing. My hands were shaking a bit, and my phone's beam wobbled against the seats. I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. I took a few slow steps down the aisle, watching the dim flashes. They reminded me of a dying flashlight that blinks when the batteries are almost gone. I didn't hear any hum of machinery. It was just silent flickering. The screen glowed, then went dark, then glowed again. Each time, it lit the theater with a ghostly light. I made my way to the front row, carefully moving around torn seats. My breathing felt shallow. My throat was dry, and I tried to swallow again. The flickering died. The screen went dark. I paused and waited. After a few seconds, it flashed again, weaker. I noticed my hands were clenched so tight that my knuckles ached. I forced my fingers to relax. I thought about leaving right then. But I also felt a strange pull to find out what was causing the light. Part of me wanted to see if maybe some leftover wiring was causing a short. With the projector gone, maybe there was an electrical glitch hooking up to the screen somehow. I decided to check the backstage area again. I found a small ladder off to the side, leading up behind the screen. I climbed it carefully. Each step creaked under my weight. My chest tightened with each sound. At the top, there was a narrow catwalk behind the screen. Dust swirled in my phone's light. Wires hung down from the ceiling. Some were taped together, others were cut or snapped off. I couldn't see anything resembling a working light source. The glow on the screen came from the front, but there was nothing behind it. I reached out to move a loose wire aside and nearly lost my balance. My foot slid on a layer of grit, and I grabbed the railing to steady myself. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might burst through my chest. I backed away, figuring there was nothing I could do from up there. When I climbed back down, the flickering on the screen had stopped. I aimed my phone at it, waiting, but no glow appeared. I felt relieved and uneasy at the same time. My mouth was dry, and my head felt a little light. I decided it was time to get out of there. I turned to walk back up the aisle. Halfway up, every seat in the row to my left rattled. It was this sudden noise of metal frames shaking. I jumped, stumbling over my own foot. My flashlight flew out of my hand and I scrambled to grab it before it hit the floor. My body was tense, every muscle tight, and my mind raced. I stood there, panting. The rattling stopped as quickly as it started. I looked at the seats, shining my light over them. They were old and rusted, but I could see them trembling for a second, then settling into stillness. I didn't see anyone. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky. I felt a wave of fear in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a gust of wind came through somewhere or something fell in the ventilation system. But the seats had rattled in a straight line, almost like someone ran their hand across them. I stood there for a moment, focusing on slowing my breathing. My legs felt stiff and my heart pounded. I moved toward the door. This time I didn't bother being quiet. My footfalls echoed. I wanted to leave. I reached the lobby again, almost tripping over a pile of debris. My mind was on edge and I kept glancing over my shoulder. The concession stand area looked darker than before. My phone's battery was getting low, and the flashlight had dimmed. I could see shapes of chairs, posters, and broken stands. The exit was near. I could taste the dust in the back of my throat. My tongue felt numb. I headed for the broken side door. It was still propped open by a piece of wood. As I reached it, I heard a metallic clang from somewhere behind me. I froze and looked back. I saw something move in the corner of my vision, but when I focused my light, there was nothing. My mind was racing, telling me to run. I took one last breath, ducked through the door, and stepped out into the night. Outside, I inhaled fresh air and coughed a little. The sky was dark, but at least the moonlight felt cleaner than the stale air inside. I turned around to look at the building. The broken side door was still ajar, revealing the darkness within. I stood there for a moment, listening for anything else. The only sounds were the distant hum of a street lamp and my own pulse thudding in my ears. I felt sweat on my forehead and wiped it away. I forced myself to walk around to the front of the cinema. The old marquee was missing letters, and the glass was shattered. I could see the faint outline of the lobby through the front doors. Everything was silent. My body was tense and my throat was scratchy. I tried to steady my breathing. I checked my watch, though I wasn't sure why. I guess I wanted a sense of normalcy. I felt some relief to be outside, but I also felt a strange pull to look inside one more time. I walked up to the cracked glass of the main door and peered in. The interior was just as dark as before. No lights flickered. I couldn't see anything moving. I thought about the seats rattling and the screen pulsing with light. My stomach clenched and I decided I was done. This place wasn't right. I turned away and headed back down the street. As I walked, I could still smell the moldy popcorn on my clothes. My mind replayed the moment when the seats shook. My arms felt clammy. Part of me wanted to find a rational explanation, maybe a loose structural beam in the floor, but my instincts told me otherwise. I kept looking over my shoulder. The old cinema loomed behind me, the historic facade crumbling under the street lamp. There was no sign of life in the windows. My footsteps echoed on the quiet sidewalk. I wanted to shake off the anxiety. My heart rate gradually slowed. The image of that flickering screen lingered in my thoughts. It was such a faint light, like a dying bulb. I tried to think of a normal reason for it. Maybe some leftover battery in an emergency system. Maybe a weird reflection from the streetlights. But none of it fit well with what I saw. Eventually, I reached my car, which was parked a few blocks away where the main street was still somewhat active. I unlocked it with shaky hands and got in. The seat felt comforting under me. I closed the door and sat there for a moment, breathing slowly. My mouth was still dry. I considered grabbing a water bottle from the back seat, but I just leaned my head against the steering wheel and closed my eyes instead. My body felt tense all over. My mind was scattered. After a minute or two, I started the engine. I glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit. My reflection looked pale, and my eyes had that wide, startled look. I backed out of the spot and drove away, not looking back at the old cinema. I wanted to get home, throw my clothes in the wash, and try to calm down with some mindless TV or a hot shower. The night air outside was cold, but the car was warm, and I let out a shaky exhale. My pulse was still a bit high. I don't know what happened in there. I just know it felt wrong. I can't shake the memory of that screen lighting up for no reason, or those seats rattling. The place was abandoned, with the projector ripped out. There shouldn't have been any flicker on that screen, but there was, and I stood there watching it. My gut tells me I never want to go back. I can't handle that sense of being trapped in the dark with weird electrical noises and unexplained movements. When I got home, I immediately took off my jacket and tossed it on a chair. I could see faint dust marks on my sleeves. My heart was still racing, and my hands trembled a little when I set my keys on the table. I went straight to the bathroom to wash my face, letting cold water run over my skin. My reflection in the mirror looked tense. I rinsed my mouth, trying to clear the taste of dust. Then I walked to my living room and sat on the couch, flicking on a lamp. The warm glow of normal light felt safe. I told myself it was an empty building, an old structure with faulty wiring. That's all. But in the back of my mind, I kept replaying the moment the chairs shook. I keep wondering if I imagined it. It felt too real. My stomach tightens whenever I think about it. I haven't told anyone about this yet. It's embarrassing, and I'm not sure anyone would believe me. People might say I was spooked by a draft or a settling floor. But I know how it felt in that moment. I know what I saw. I don't plan on going back. The memory is still too fresh. My shoulders are tense right now, just remembering how the door squeaked, how the dust motes floated in my flashlight beam, and how I nearly dropped my phone when the screen started flickering. That old cinema can stay abandoned for all I care. As far as I'm concerned, I got my look inside, and that's more than enough. I'm not curious anymore. Whatever was in there, faulty wires or not, I'm done with it. I'll drive by that building next week on my way to work, but I'm not stepping foot in there again. It's off my list permanently. I'll never forget the way that abandoned house looked on my first day of work as a delivery driver. I was heading to my third stop of the evening, and I saw this dark shape sitting right off the main highway. The windows were all boarded up, and there was a gap at the bottom of the garage door. It stuck in my mind for the rest of that shift. Whenever I drove by, I'd glance over. Sometimes I thought I saw movement inside, but it could have been the wind or my own nerves playing tricks. Every time I passed that house, I felt my shoulders tense up. The place didn't feel right. It looked like something was wrong with it on a deeper level, even though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. I deliver packages for a local courier service, nothing fancy. People order online, and I bring their items right to their door. It's straightforward work, and I'm used to driving around in all sorts of weather and all sorts of neighborhoods. But that house was different. It was jammed between the tree line and the back edge of a small ditch along the highway. The boards on the windows were old, warped, and nailed in sloppy lines. The garage door had that opening at the bottom, like maybe the hinges were off balance or something. The roof looked caved in near the back. Most people probably drove right by and never even noticed it, but I couldn't ignore it. One night, I got caught in a nasty rainstorm while heading home. It was late, around 9 at night, and my usual route was blocked by some accident. The detour led me past that abandoned house again. I was tired. The rain was hitting my windshield so hard I could barely see the road, and I felt my nerves building up. I just wanted a dry place to wait until the storm settled a bit. My wipers weren't helping much, and I found myself slowing down near that house, fighting a lump in my throat. I remember thinking, am I really going to pull over there? But I did. I parked on the muddy shoulder about 10 feet from the house's driveway and left the engine running for a moment while I stared at the garage door. It was open a crack, maybe 2 feet. I could see darkness behind it. The boards on the windows were drenched in rainwater and the driveway was full of weeds and puddles. I killed the engine and flicked on my flashlight. I stepped out, and the cold rain hammered down on my jacket. My boots sank into the mud. There wasn't much traffic on the highway at that hour, so I couldn't count on someone else stopping to help if I ran into a problem. But I just wanted to get out of that downpour, so I walked up to the garage. The door groaned when I pushed it, and it slid up a bit more, but not all the way. Something was stuck or the mechanism was broken. Either way, there was enough room for me to duck in. Inside, it smelled like mold and old tires. The floor was cracked concrete, and the space was full of random junk. Half-broken chairs, a rusted fridge, a couple of planks leaning against the wall. I stood there dripping water onto the ground, keeping my flashlight pointed around to see if anyone was squatting in there. I didn't see any signs of life, just a lot of dust and cobwebs. The walls had marks from where someone had tried to paint them a dull gray, then given up halfway. The overhead light fixture was just a broken bulb hanging by a wire. I noticed a door at the back of the garage that led inside the house. The doorknob was missing, and the door itself looked a little warped from moisture. I thought about just staying in the garage, but the rain was still blowing in through the gap. I figured I'd step inside the house for a minute, just to stand somewhere dry until the worst of the storm passed. So I walked over, grabbed the edge of the door and gave it a tug. It opened with a crunching noise like wood splintering. A burst of stale air hit me, and I coughed. My flashlight beam showed a narrow hallway with a battered linoleum floor. The place smelled damp, and there was a faint chemical odor that reminded me of old paint or something similar. I took a few steps in, careful not to slip. The walls in that hallway had dark stains near the baseboards. I tried not to think about what caused them. I just wanted a dry place to wait out the storm. The sound of rain hitting the roof was loud, and the wind rattled something on the other side of the house. I considered turning around and leaving, but then another gust of rain blew in from the garage, and I decided I might as well check for a better spot to stand. I moved deeper into the house. The hallway led to a living room on the left. The windows were all boarded from the inside, and it was pitch black except for my flashlight beam. I saw a dusty couch with torn upholstery, a coffee table with missing legs, and newspapers scattered across the floor. The newspapers were so old they had turned yellow and brittle. The front page I could see had a date from years ago. I glanced around for any sign of animals or people, but it looked abandoned. Completely empty, aside from trash and a few random pieces of ruined furniture. I heard a drip coming from somewhere near the ceiling. Water must have been leaking in through the damaged roof. Each drop echoed. I kept moving through the living room, shining my light over the walls. That's when I saw something that made my stomach clench. There were handprints on one section of the wall near the boarded window. They looked like dirty smudges, as if someone with grimy hands had pushed against the wall over and over. Some of the marks had streaks trailing down like fingernail scraping. I stepped closer and noticed the paint was scratched in long lines. I felt a chill go up my back. It was the kind of feeling that made me want to turn around and run. But I also felt curious about who had been here and why. The house was empty now, though, so I decided to keep looking around. I moved back to the hallway and continued down toward what looked like a kitchen area. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I held my breath every time it made a loud snap. The kitchen was a mess. The cabinets hung off their hinges, and there was a table flipped over in the corner. Broken glass littered the countertop. I didn't see any appliances, just old pipes where maybe a sink had been. The boards over the window in the kitchen had gaps, letting in a sliver of the streetlight glow from outside. In that faint light, I could see more of those hand marks. This time, they weren't just smudges. The paint was peeled in some spots where fingernails had scratched deeply. I imagined someone locked inside trying to get out. My heart started pounding. I tried to brush that thought aside, telling myself it was probably just vandalism, kids messing around. But the sight of those scratches made my pulse race. It was quiet, except for the storm outside and the dripping from the ceiling. The air felt heavy. My flashlight flickered for a moment and I tapped it against my palm until it steadied. I wanted to check another room, maybe see if there was any sign of an exit I could open for better ventilation, or at least a spot that wasn't dripping. I found another door near the kitchen that led to a short staircase going down, maybe a basement. I wasn't sure if I should go down there, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As soon as I aimed my flashlight down the steps, I noticed they were made of concrete and were slick with water or some other liquid. I stepped carefully, not wanting to slip. The air down there smelled musty like wet cardboard. The ceiling was low, and I had to duck a bit. When I reached the bottom, my flashlight showed a small basement room with cinder block walls. There was an old water heater in one corner and some shelves lined with paint cans and tools. Most of it was rusted or covered in cobwebs. I walked around, shining the light on every surface. More scratches on the walls. The scratch marks down here looked deeper. Long vertical lines, like someone had been in a panic. My chest felt tight. I kept swallowing, trying to calm down. I heard something then, like a faint tapping or scraping noise. It sounded like it was coming from behind one of the cinder block walls. I stood still, aiming the flashlight around, trying to pinpoint the source. The noise faded, and I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it was just a loose pipe or an animal in the walls. I breathed out and told myself to relax, but I could feel the sweat on my forehead despite the cold air. I decided I'd had enough. I turned around and climbed the stairs. My heart was beating too fast, and my hands were shaking a little. I wanted to get back to my car. I walked quickly through the kitchen, not bothering to check anything else. But on my way past the living room again, something caught my eye. There was a doorway on the other side of that room, leading to another hall, or maybe a bedroom. I froze for a second. My flashlight was pointed at the doorway, and I saw more marks on the wall just inside that room. They looked even more frantic, like multiple sets of hands had pressed and dragged across the surface. Against my better judgment, I stepped over some debris and peered into that room. It was smaller, maybe a bedroom. The boards on the window were thick, letting almost no light in. My flashlight beam showed a mattress on the floor, stained and torn. There were ropes tied to the bed frame. They looked old and rotten, but I could see the knots. My mouth went dry. I felt a sick feeling in my stomach. I wanted to get out of that house as fast as possible. I turned around and headed for the garage. The storm outside could have been a full-blown hurricane, and I wouldn't have cared. I didn't want to stay in that place another second. As I reached the garage door, I heard another noise. It was like a soft creak from somewhere behind me. I stopped, listened, heard nothing else. The wind outside was howling, and rain slapped against the boards. I pulled the garage door up as far as it would go and ducked under. Then I ran across the soggy driveway to my car. My boots splashed in the puddles and the rain pelted my face. I yanked my door open and jumped in. My heart was pounding. My hands were shaking so much that I fumbled with the key. Finally, I got the engine started. The headlights lit up the house. In that moment, I saw the garage door slam shut. It happened too fast to be just the wind, but I told myself it must have been the wind anyway because the alternative was too disturbing. I got onto the highway and floored it, ignoring the water on the road. My mind was racing. I kept picturing those handprints, those scratch marks, that mattress with ropes. I felt like I'd stepped into something I shouldn't have. I felt dirty and unsettled. My throat was dry and my heart wouldn't slow down for several minutes. Even after I made it home, I couldn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the walls with those scratches, heard that odd tapping in the basement, pictured the ropes on the bed frame. It was like my brain wouldn't let me rest. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about what I'd seen. I told myself it was just a weird old house and that plenty of squatters or vandals had probably come through over the years. But whenever I drove past that spot on another route, my chest tightened. I'd look over and see that same shape of the house. From the road, it looked harmless in the daylight, just a boarded-up building. But I knew what was inside. Those marks, that atmosphere, the stale air. I never saw the garage door open again, and I never got close enough to check. My hands would grip the steering wheel, and I'd keep my eyes on the road until I was well past it. Sometimes I wonder if there was someone in there that night. Maybe they were in another room watching me. Maybe they were the one who slammed the garage door. I'll never know. I'm not going back in there. I don't care if it's sunny, rainy, or if the apocalypse is happening. I'm staying away. That house isn't safe. I feel it in my bones. People ask me about scary deliveries or strange experiences on the job, and I usually shrug it off. But in my head, I remember every detail of that place. The smell of mold, the squeak of wet shoes on the linoleum, the scratch marks on the walls, and those ropes. Even now, just thinking about it makes my skin crawl. I still get nervous driving past that highway stretch. I keep my eyes forward and try not to look to the side at all. I keep telling myself I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was just a stormy night and an old house. But no matter how many times I repeat that to myself, I can't shake the unease. That memory lives in my head. It doesn't go away. So I keep my distance. I focus on my work. I deliver my packages and mind my own business. But I never seek shelter in strange buildings anymore. If it's raining, I'll sit in my truck. If I have a flat tire, I'll wait for roadside assistance. Nothing is worth stepping into a place like that again. Sometimes an open door is better left alone. I still remember the night my uncle first told me about the old plant where he used to work as a security guard. He said it closed down years ago because they couldn't afford to keep it running. He also said there were sections so eerie that even the most seasoned workers refused to enter them after dark. That got stuck in my head. It didn't sound like a typical ghost story. It sounded like there were real events in that place, things my uncle had seen or heard. I couldn't let it go. A few weeks ago, I decided to explore the place myself. I drove out around dusk. The sun was low and I felt a slight twinge in my stomach as I parked in front of the chain-link fence. The gate stood open, rusted at the hinges and leaning to one side. The main building looked like a brick fortress, all dark windows and weeds pushing through the cracks in the concrete. I sat in my car for a minute, tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about the stories I'd heard. My uncle always told me to trust my gut, but my curiosity was stronger than my caution. I grabbed a flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped outside. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but there weren't any clouds overhead. I looked around. Nobody else was there. I tested the gate. The metal rattled but didn't fall. I slipped through and walked up to the front doors. They were huge metal doors with chipped paint. They groaned when I pulled one open. The sound echoed into the empty lobby. The lobby was large with a high ceiling and rows of old lights that had once hung proudly. Now, some were missing, and others dangled by their wires. A thick layer of dust covered the floor. I saw scattered footprints heading in different directions, maybe left behind by scavengers or other explorers. I turned on my flashlight and waved the beam across the walls. Flyers and notices clung to bulletin boards, their corners curled and yellow. I stepped forward. Each step kicked up little clouds of dust around my shoes. I remembered my uncle's stories about certain corridors and rooms that felt off. He claimed he heard noises there, whispers or footsteps, even though nobody else was around. He said that feeling never left him, even after he punched out at the end of his shift. I wanted to see if those stories made sense, or if he had just been messing with me. I started in what looked like an office area. The open plan space had rows of old cubicles and battered chairs. I walked around, shining my flashlight on desks covered with papers, coffee cups, and personal trinkets. One of the mugs had a thick layer of mold inside. I covered my nose and mouth with my sleeve. The air was stale with a hint of rot. I tried to open a few drawers, but most were locked or jammed. I noticed that the footprints on the floor seemed fresher than I expected. The dust wasn't too disturbed, but I could make out the outlines of shoes that weren't mine. They headed deeper into the building, toward the back corridors. I listened carefully. I didn't hear anything. Still, I thought about how strange it was that someone had been here recently enough to leave fresh prints. I decided to follow them. They led me past the cubicles, down a narrow hallway with flickering emergency lights overhead. Each flicker made the shadows jump across the walls. My heart rate went up a bit. I took slow steps. I didn't want to make much noise. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. At the end of the hallway, there was a stairwell going down. The door was propped open with a small block of wood. I peeked inside. I aimed my flashlight down the steps. It was dark. I couldn't see the bottom. I thought about turning around, but something made me move forward. I stepped onto the first stair, and the old metal groaned under my feet. I gripped the railing. It felt cold and dusty. I took one step at a time. My flashlight revealed cracks in the concrete walls. A few pipes ran along the ceiling. The place smelled damp, like old water had seeped in. I kept going until I reached the bottom, which opened up into a service corridor. This must have been where my uncle spent most of his overnight shifts. The corridor stretched to the left and right. My flashlight barely reached far enough to see the ends. The footprints I'd been following led to the left, so that's where I went. The air was colder down here. I rubbed my arms to chase away the chill. Old electrical boxes hung on the walls, some with their doors open, wires exposed. A couple of overhead lights flickered on and off every few seconds, creating quick bursts of illumination. I found a door marked Maintenance. I turned the knob, and it swung open with a whining hinge. Inside there were shelves of tools, cleaning supplies, and a few half-empty boxes of light bulbs. A large sink in the corner was stained with rust. I looked around, carefully checking the floor for footprints. The dust was thick, except near the center, where I saw a fresh shoe print. It pointed toward the far wall. I aimed my flashlight there and saw nothing but a big metal cabinet. The cabinet was closed. I opened it, expecting to find old towels or random tools. It was empty. I stood there for a moment, feeling confused. Why would somebody come in just to stand at a dead end? I left the maintenance room and continued down the corridor. I heard a faint scratching sound. It stopped as soon as I paused to listen. I swung the flashlight beam from one side of the corridor to the other. Nothing moved. The only sound was my own breathing. I forced myself to keep going. The next door on the right was locked, so I moved on to a double door at the end of the corridor. It had a sign above it that said storage. I pulled one side open, shining my flashlight inside. Shelves ran from floor to ceiling, filled with old boxes of supplies and spare parts. My footsteps echoed in the large space. The floor was concrete, stained with oil in a few spots. I saw a flicker of movement on the far side of the room. My breath caught in my throat, and I clicked off my flashlight for a second, hoping my eyes would adjust. But the only light now was the occasional flicker from the corridor behind me. I turned the flashlight back on. I advanced slowly, shining the beam around the shelves. Nothing was there. My pulse was pounding and I felt sweat trickling down my back. I decided to speak. I said, "Hello?" My voice echoed. Nobody answered. I felt my stomach tighten. Something about that space made me uneasy. It was too quiet, and the fresh footprints were a reminder that I wasn't alone. But I didn't see or hear anyone else. I left the storage area and returned to the corridor. I kept moving, noticing that the footprints were no longer visible on the dusty floor. It was as if they ended right there. I tried to figure out if I'd missed any side passages or doors. Everything was locked except for those I'd already opened. I felt a strong urge to get out, but I also wanted to check the upper levels. My uncle mentioned that the top floor had a break room with a few offices attached. I retraced my steps to the stairwell and climbed back up. My legs felt tight from the tension. When I reached the lobby again, I realized it was fully dark outside. I could see the moonlight shining through the broken windows. The building was silent. but it didn't feel empty. My uncle's warnings kept running through my head. The wall seemed to close in a bit and my palms felt clammy. I headed for another set of stairs near the lobby. They led to the second floor, which was mostly administrative offices and a large conference room. The conference room door stood wide open. Chairs were scattered around a long table and the remnants of some old projector sat in the corner. There were more footprints in the dust, but these looked older, half erased by time. I walked around the table, shining my flashlight at the walls. There were shelves with binders and manuals. I flipped through one. The pages were filled with technical diagrams and lists of chemical compounds. The edges were brittle, and a few pages fell out when I tried to turn them. A loud clang echoed from somewhere behind me. It sounded like a metal object hitting the floor. My chest tightened. I spun around, pointing my flashlight at the door. Nobody was there. The noise came from somewhere down the hallway. I took a deep breath and forced my feet to move. My heart pounded as I stepped back into the corridor. I saw a metal bucket on its side, rolling slightly on the floor. It bumped into the wall and stopped. My flashlight caught a quick reflection off its surface. I hadn't noticed a bucket there before. It was like it had been knocked off something. I looked around for a shelf or a cart. There was nothing in the immediate area that could have held a bucket. I felt a chill run through my arms. My flashlight started to feel heavier in my hand. I decided I'd had enough. The footprints, the random noises, the unsettling atmosphere, it all felt too close. My uncle warned me, and I had confirmed that the place gave off a bad vibe at night. I wanted to get out before something worse happened. I turned around and headed for the main stairs that led down to the lobby again. As I passed one of the offices, I heard a soft creak. It sounded like a door opening slowly. I aimed my flashlight at the office door and saw it was slightly ajar. I hadn't checked that room earlier. The sign on the door was missing, just a blank metal frame. I pushed the door open with the toe of my shoe. The hinge groaned. Inside there was a small office with a single desk, a chair, and a couple of file cabinets. The dust was thick on the floor. But at the back of the room I saw footprints. They circled the desk, then stopped at the wall. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight around. There was no other door. It was just a blank wall with chipped paint and a few cracks. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I was sure I was alone, but those footprints looked recent. The dust around them was disturbed, almost damp in spots, as if the person had brought in moisture from outside. I swallowed hard and backed out of the office. I didn't want to stay any longer. My pulse hammered, and my mouth felt dry. I hurried to the stairs without looking back. My flashlight flickered once, but it stayed on. I didn't care to check if the batteries were low. I just needed to leave. Back in the lobby, I made a beeline for the front doors. My footsteps sounded too loud. I expected someone or something to jump out at any moment. My hands shook a bit as I grabbed the door handle and pulled. The same groan echoed through the space. I stepped out into the cool night air and felt relief wash over me. The tension in my chest loosened, and I took a deep breath. I glanced back through the door. The lobby was still and dark. The footprints I'd followed earlier were now barely visible from the outside. I let the door swing shut behind me. The hinges creaked, then settled with a dull thud. I walked across the lot, past the rusted gate, and got into my car. My heart was still pounding, and I took a moment to gather myself. I started the engine and turned on the headlights. As I drove away, I felt a surge of adrenaline leave my body, replaced by a stiff ache in my shoulders. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road. But there was nothing except empty darkness. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined some of it. But the fresh footprints in the dust were real. The noises were real. That bucket didn't just knock itself over. I thought about my uncle, about the rumors he'd shared. In my head, I could hear him saying, "Some things aren't worth finding out." That night, I got home and locked my door. My clothes were dusty and my throat felt dry. I drank a big glass of water, then sat at my kitchen table staring at the wall. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there with me in that building. I still don't know who it was or why they were hiding. Maybe it was just another person exploring. Maybe it was a vagrant who needed shelter. Or maybe it was something else. Something that liked the darkness and the silence of an abandoned place. I'm not sure if I'll ever go back. The memory of those footprints in the dust, leading nowhere, keeps me from making that decision lightly. My uncle used to say, "You'll never find peace once you see what you're not supposed to see." For a long time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I'm not so sure. All I know is that I went into that building alone and I left alone. But during the time I was inside, I never really felt by myself. I first saw that place on a late afternoon when I was collecting material for my college research. I had heard rumors about an old dorm wing where personal belongings were left behind and never picked up, but I hadn't expected to find anything too strange. People kept warning me that the atmosphere was heavy and that no one liked to hang around there after dark. I figured they were just trying to spook me. I went anyway, feeling a mix of curiosity and impatience. I had a deadline to meet, and I wanted to see the building's interior for myself. I wanted photos, details for my report, and maybe a few quotes from any caretaker if I could find one. When I arrived, the exterior looked normal. The front yard was overgrown, with weeds reaching past my ankles. The windows on the second floor were boarded up in some spots, and a few shutters hung loose on rusty hinges. The main door was unlocked, which surprised me. I expected some kind of chain or padlock, but there was nothing. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and a gust of stale air hit my face. I noticed dust motes drifting in the weak light that slipped through the narrow windows. I pulled out my phone and tried to use the flashlight. The battery was at half, but the light was enough. I followed a short hallway that led to a wide foyer. My footsteps made a scraping sound against the old tile floor. There was a reception desk on one side, covered in layers of dust. Behind it, I saw a corridor stretching into darkness. I glanced around for signs of squatters or security, but I didn't see or hear anything. Everything was silent except for the faint echo of my own movements. The first room I checked looked like some sort of lounge. There were chairs stacked against a wall and a few tables that were turned on their sides. I saw scattered magazines on a corner table, but they were so worn I couldn't read the covers. The smell reminded me of old basements or attics, where air hasn't circulated in a long time. My nose itched, and I coughed a bit. I kept my flashlight trained on the floor, watching for holes or broken glass. I saw a few roaches scurrying away from the light. I moved back into the main corridor. On the left, I found a set of double doors that opened into a large room lined with bunk beds. Most of the mattresses were thin and looked stained, but the sheets on them were neatly folded. The sheets were worn out, yellowish in places with frayed edges. I found it odd that someone had taken the time to fold them, but never removed them. On top of one of the bunks, I noticed a small metal box. I lifted the lid, and inside were random trinkets, a few hair ties, a broken comb, and some old coins. None of it seemed valuable, but it felt personal. That was the moment I realized the rumors were true. People had left a lot of belongings here untouched. I walked between the rows of bunk beds, shining my flashlight under them. I spotted a couple of shoes with thick dust on them. I saw some small articles of clothing folded in a corner. I avoided touching anything else. I just snapped a few pictures. I didn't want to disturb whatever was left. It felt eerie, and I couldn't explain why. The building was silent, but my heart started to pound a bit harder. I decided to keep moving, see if there was more to discover, and then get out. I didn't want to linger in that dorm area too long. I stepped out into the corridor again, and that's when I thought I heard something. A quick pattering sound like footsteps running. It was a light, rapid noise. I froze, shining my phone light in the direction of the sound. I saw a door at the end of the hall, but it didn't move. My ears were strained, trying to catch any other hint of movement. I didn't hear anything else. I convinced myself it might have been an animal, maybe a stray cat or a rat. I forced myself to keep going. I turned a corner and found another corridor with windows on one side. The glass was so dirty that the outside light barely made a difference. The floor here was covered in debris, small bits of plaster, some broken ceiling tiles, and random scraps of paper. My footsteps crunched on the rubble, and each step made me more anxious. The silence was thick. I felt sweat forming on my forehead and my mouth got dry. I was scanning the corridor for any open door or sign of life. On the right, I saw a door labeled storage. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open wider and saw metal shelves, mostly empty. A few boxes remained in the corner, all dusty. One box had old notebooks, the pages wrinkled and covered in mold spots. Another had rusted tools. I felt a strange tension in the air, like I was intruding. I still heard nothing, but my nerves were on edge. After a minute, I decided to leave. When I returned to the hallway, I heard a sudden banging noise. It sounded like doors slamming. It was distant, but still loud enough to make my pulse jump. The sound echoed through the corridor, and I instinctively ducked my head, like I expected something to rush at me. Nothing did. The corridor was still. I shined my flashlight back and forth, trying to pinpoint where the noise came from. Was it behind me or did it come from ahead? I couldn't tell. I took a few deep breaths and told myself to calm down. The building was old. Maybe a breeze had pushed a loose door. But I hadn't felt any breeze since I walked in. The air felt stale and still. My legs felt a bit shaky, but I decided to keep going forward. I wanted to look for a caretaker's office or maybe a file room that could have documents for my project. That was my initial goal, after all. I saw another set of stairs at the end of the corridor. The steps were concrete, chipped at the edges. There was a faint overhead light at the top of the stairs. I climbed up slowly, keeping my phone pointed ahead. Each step made a hollow, echoing sound. My breathing was loud in my ears. At the top, I found another hallway, narrower than the one below. The walls here were peeling, revealing an older layer of paint beneath. A few doors lined the left side, each with a small glass window. They looked like offices or administrative rooms. I tried the first door. It was locked. The second door opened with a squeak. Inside, there was a large wooden desk covered in dust, a filing cabinet on its side, and papers scattered on the floor. I picked up one sheet and saw a date from decades ago. It looked like some kind of inventory list, but the ink was faded. I skimmed a few lines, snapped photos with my phone, and moved toward the cabinet. Most of its drawers were stuck or empty. I found a single folder stuffed behind it, but it was falling apart. I took pictures of each page I could make out. Then I heard that banging again, doors slamming. This time it sounded closer, like it was coming from the stairs I had just climbed. My stomach tightened and I broke into a cold sweat. I stopped breathing for a second, just listening. The slamming continued, one door after another, like someone was moving down the hallway, banging doors shut as they passed. Or maybe it was wind somehow gusting through. But the pattern felt too deliberate. I stood still, phone in hand, heart pounding. Then, silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing, no footsteps, no doors, no voices. My hand shook a bit and I realized how tense my whole body was. I exhaled and decided I needed to see who or what was making those noises. Maybe there was a guard trying to scare me off. I left the office and crept toward the stairs. The hallway was empty. The lights overhead flickered. There was a single bulb still working, and it made the peeling walls look even more decayed. I stepped carefully, trying not to make too much noise. When I reached the stairs, I looked down. The lower corridor was dark, but I didn't see anyone there. I strained my ears again, and that's when I heard a faint shuffling sound behind me. I spun around. The hallway was empty. My breathing was shallow. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I thought about running out the front door and leaving this place behind. But I reminded myself I had come all this way for my research. I told myself to suck it up, get a bit more info, and then go. I returned to the corridor, shining my light into each office window. Most rooms were empty or full of junk. I saw overturned chairs, old shelves, broken fans. The further I went, the more I felt like someone was watching me. My shoulders were tense and I kept turning around, convinced I'd see someone lurking. But each time there was nothing, just the flickering light and the stale air. Eventually, I came to the end of the hall. There was a door that looked heavier than the others. The sign on it was faded, but I could make out something about records or archives. This was exactly the type of room I had hoped to find. I tried the handle and it resisted at first, but after I leaned into it, the door popped open. Inside, there were shelves all around, stuffed with binders and boxes. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I stepped in slowly, shining my flashlight along the rows. It looked like the perfect place to find old registration lists or some kind of data I could use in my project. I reached for a box on the nearest shelf. The cardboard felt damp, and it sagged when I lifted it. I placed it on a nearby wooden table, which wobbled but held. I opened the box, flipping through more papers that were brittle and yellowed. Some pages stuck together, and bits flaked off in my hands. I tried to read whatever was legible. It was mostly notes about daily routines, mention of personal belongings that had been left behind, and logs of certain objects not collected by their owners. I snapped photos as best I could, using my phone's flashlight to see. Then I heard a loud crash from somewhere outside the archive room. It was so startling that I dropped a few papers on the floor. I stood up straight, heart racing. The noise had come from the corridor, like something big had been knocked over. I had that awful feeling in my stomach again, like I was about to confront someone or something that didn't want me here. I took a deep breath and walked out of the archive room, shining my flashlight around. The corridor was the same as before, except now I noticed a chair that hadn't been in the middle of the hallway when I first came this way. It was flipped on its side, wheels spinning slowly as if it had just been pushed. My throat went dry. I thought about how that chair got there. The corridor had been clear before. I stared at it for a few seconds, then decided I had enough. I turned and headed for the stairs. As I approached them, I heard quick, running footsteps again, this time right above me. I froze. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The footsteps raced down the hall on the floor above, and I heard doors slamming again, one after another. It wasn't the wind. It sounded too deliberate. I imagined someone rushing from door to door, banging each one, then sprinting to the next. I rushed down the stairs, practically hopping 2 steps at a time. At the bottom, I reached the corridor with the bunk room entrance. I noticed the door to the dorm wing was half closed, even though I remembered leaving it open. I got a strong urge to look inside one more time, but my nerves were shot. My legs felt weak and my hands were clammy. I just wanted to leave. I headed for the main lobby. My flashlight beam shook with each step. When I made it back to the foyer, the front door was still open, exactly how I left it. Outside light seeped in, creating a dusty glow in the doorway. I walked out into the overgrown yard, heart pounding, mouth dry, feeling like I'd barely escaped some bizarre situation. I turned around briefly to look at the facade of the building. The windows looked lifeless, no sign of movement. But inside somewhere I knew something was making those noises. It felt like I had only scratched the surface of what was really going on. I decided I had enough material for my project. My camera roll was full of pictures, and I had a phone full of notes. I felt uneasy, like I was leaving questions unanswered, but I didn't care at that moment. My only thought was to get away from that building before anything else happened. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The building grew smaller behind me, but my hands were still shaking on the wheel. I thought about the slamming doors and the sound of those footsteps. I couldn't come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was just my imagination. All I know is I felt watched in there, and I heard those noises clearly. I haven't been back since. I still have all the photos and notes, and they've satisfied my project requirements. But late at night, I sometimes think about the folded sheets in that dorm area, the personal items left on the bunk beds, and the weird way it felt like someone was running through the halls, banging every door on purpose. I don't like to dwell on it for too long. That place was more than just an old building with some unclaimed belongings. It felt charged with something, and I decided not to push my luck. I told myself I'd never return alone. That's everything that happened. I still can't explain it, and I'm not even sure I want to. I got what I needed for school, and as far as I'm concerned, that's all I need to do with that building. If anyone wants more info, they can go in and check it out themselves. But they should be ready for locked doors that slam by themselves, footsteps that rush past empty hallways, and a tension in the air that makes your skin crawl. I sure don't plan on going back anytime soon. I decided to keep my barbershop open all night because I thought there was a market for people who needed a late cut. I took a chance on it, thinking I'd catch some truck drivers or insomniacs who wanted to feel fresh at odd hours. At first, I liked the quiet. I could sweep the floor, restock supplies, and have some time for myself. But the nights got longer. Sometimes, the place was dead for hours. I'd brew coffee just to stay awake. One night, around 3 in the morning, I was cleaning the mirrors. I looked up and saw a face that wasn't mine. It was an older man with sunken cheeks. He stared back at me, but his expression shifted before I even reacted. My heart thumped. My hands froze on the cloth I was using. Then I blinked, and my own face returned. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I want to be clear. I didn't see shapes in the shadows or hear voices in the walls. This was just a mirror right in front of me. I've looked at my reflection plenty of times, every day in fact. I know my face, my jawline, and the lines around my eyes. The man I saw had deeper wrinkles. His eyes sat back in his skull like he hadn't slept in days. I took a breath, rubbed my eyes, and kept cleaning. Then, around half an hour later, I walked past the mirror to answer my phone. My reflection was there, but it moved too soon. It twitched its shoulder an instant before I turned. That made my skin crawl. My forehead felt damp, and I checked the room behind me. Nobody was there. I paced in front of the mirror, testing it. My reflection moved with me, but sometimes it was half a second ahead. And sometimes it changed. The face looked older, then switched back to mine. I remember my mouth going dry, and I wanted to lock up right then. But I'd decided to do 24 hours, and I felt stubborn about it. I wasn't about to run out of my own shop because of a mirror. I tried to ignore the mirror after that. I stayed in the waiting area, messing with my phone, checking the time every few minutes. I had the TV on low volume. The flicker of the screen made the place feel less empty. A few hours passed, and I considered dozing off on one of the barber chairs. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt a jolt of nervous energy in my chest. My thoughts wandered back to that reflection. I kept imagining that older face, the hollow cheeks, and the way it moved first. I got up and paced around to stay awake. My legs felt heavy. My stomach clenched a bit like I'd eaten something bad. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was seeing things because I was exhausted. I'd had too much caffeine and not enough real sleep. I forced myself to look in the mirror one more time before sunrise. I didn't see anything strange. I locked up at 6 in the morning when my day shift guy showed up. I went home and crashed for a few hours. When I came back that evening, I told myself I'd handle the night shift again. I wanted to prove I could do it. The first few hours were normal. A couple of guys came in, truckers passing through, wanting a shave and trim. I made small talk, took their money, and they left. Then midnight rolled around and I was alone again. The shop went quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder. I flipped through some old magazines but couldn't focus on any article. I kept glancing at that mirror. I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection out of the corner of my eye and my throat would tighten. My palms got moist. I decided to stand up, face that mirror, and see what would happen. I moved my arms slowly, raising them over my head. My reflection followed, but it was delayed by a fraction of a second. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck like a chill. I waved. The reflection waved back, but its expression looked more serious than mine. I let out a shaky laugh. Then, the reflection frowned. I hadn't frowned. My face felt neutral, a bit nervous maybe, but not a frown. Seeing that expression made me step back. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I turned away. I wiped down the counter. I reorganized my scissors, combs, and razors. I checked my phone, hoping someone would text me, but there was nothing. A single car passed by outside, and its headlights flashed across the shop window. I watched the lights slide across the wall. Then I glanced at the mirror again. I saw the older man's face. He had a short beard that looked patchy. His jaw was set in a tight line. I could see the wrinkles on his forehead. He didn't mirror my posture. I was standing with my shoulders hunched, but he stood rigid, staring forward. I wanted to look away, but my eyes stayed locked on him. My chest felt tight, and I could sense my pulse in my temples. Then he twitched his head, like he was looking at me from the inside of the mirror. It looked unnatural. He leaned toward me, and I stumbled backward. I almost tripped over the footrest of one of the chairs. My breath caught in my throat. Then my phone rang. I jumped so hard I nearly dropped it. It was my friend calling just to chat. I tried to act calm, but my voice sounded shaky. I told him the shop was quiet and I was tired. He asked if I wanted company, but it was almost 2 a.m., and he lived across town. I said I'd be fine. I hung up and felt a wave of regret. Maybe I should have let him come by. I felt alone, like the room was pressing in on me. I glanced at the mirror. The face was gone. My normal reflection was back. My shoulders eased a bit. I felt silly, but I also felt uneasy. I locked the bathroom door from the inside, forcing myself to use the main mirror as little as possible. I brewed another pot of coffee and tried to stay near the front of the shop. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint scraping sound. It came from somewhere near the back wall behind the mirror. I set my coffee down. My hands were shaking. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and walked over. There's a small maintenance closet back there. I opened it and shone the light inside. Nothing was out of place. The sound stopped. My spine tingled. I rubbed the back of my neck and tried to swallow the lump in my throat. Then I closed the closet and turned around. The mirror was right there, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. I saw my face in the circle of light, but my reflection had those hollow eyes again. I swear I felt my heartbeat shift. My fingers felt numb. I let out a low grunt like I was about to yell, but held it in. The reflection stepped forward and I heard my breath catch. I stood still, but the figure in the mirror kept moving. It reached out, pressing its hands against the glass on its side. I didn't see any shift in the real world. The mirror itself didn't move. It was just that image, pressing closer. I backed away, not taking my eyes off the mirror. My shoes squeaked on the tile floor. I shut the flashlight off, thinking maybe it was some trick of the light. But even in the dim glow from the overhead fixtures, the old man was still there. He stared at me, eyes filled with something I couldn't place. I turned and scrambled toward the front door. I flipped the sign to closed. Then I realized I was supposed to be open 24 hours. But in that moment, I didn't care. I locked the door and sat on the waiting bench, arms folded, trying to calm down. My breathing was shallow and my legs felt twitchy. The adrenaline buzzed in my body, making it impossible to sit still. I checked the time on my phone, 3:30 a.m. I had a couple of hours until sunrise. I decided to wait it out. Maybe sunlight would chase away whatever this was. I stared at the mirror from the waiting area. The figure disappeared. I saw my normal reflection, even from that angle. That made me question my own mind. Could it be exhaustion? Could I be hallucinating? I rubbed my eyes hard. They felt gritty. I realized I hadn't had a proper night's sleep in weeks. My hands were stiff from gripping the arms of the bench. I tried to distract myself by tidying up the front counter. I counted the cash in the register. But every few seconds I found myself glancing at the mirror. For a while it stayed normal. At around 4, my eyes felt so heavy that I decided to lean back on the bench and just rest them. I set my phone alarm for 5 so I wouldn't oversleep if any customer walked in. I must have dozed off. I snapped awake to the sound of something tapping on glass. It was a light, rhythmic tap, like a knuckle on a window. I checked the front door. Nobody was there. Then I realized the noise came from behind me, from the mirror. My arms tensed, and I turned around. The older man's face was inches away from the glass, like he was inside the reflection trying to get out. He tapped again. I jumped up. The hair on my arm stood up. I felt my stomach flip. I wanted to shout, but no sound came out. The tapping was steady. He moved his mouth. I couldn't hear any words, but I saw his lips moving in quick bursts. It looked like he was muttering something or calling me to come closer. I didn't budge. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Then the tapping stopped. He pressed his hand against the glass on his side and tilted his head, watching me. I didn't know what to do. I grabbed my phone and went to the restroom. I sat on the toilet lid with the door locked and tried to catch my breath. My fingers were trembling. I stared at the tile floor, focusing on the cracks. I told myself to wait for the sun. I'd already closed the shop, and nobody was likely to come in now. I could survive another couple of hours. The mirror in the restroom is a small one above the sink. I was afraid to look into it. I caught a glimpse of my reflection. It was just me. My eyes had bags under them, and my skin looked pale, but I still looked like myself. I stayed there for about half an hour, occasionally pressing my ear against the door to listen for any sounds. I didn't hear anything else. Finally, I crept out, scanning the barbershop. It was quiet. The main mirror looked normal again, just a piece of glass reflecting the chairs, the supplies, and me. I approached it slowly. My reflection matched me perfectly. My heart was still racing, but I felt a bit calmer. I wiped my forehead, noticing how sweaty I was. I flicked off half the lights and kept the ones near the front door on. Then I paced until sunrise. When daylight finally crept through the front windows, I felt safer. The tension in my shoulders loosened. The reflection stayed normal. I unlocked the door, turned the sign around to open, and waited for the day shift guy. When he showed up, I told him I needed some rest. I didn't explain what I'd seen. I just said I was feeling rough. I left him in charge and drove home. Even in my car, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror to check my eyes. I kept expecting to see that older man's face again, but it didn't show up there. I got home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I felt anxious, my body tense, my feet kicking at the sheets. After a few hours of restless dozing, I got up. I considered skipping the night shift, but I felt like I had to face it. It was my shop, and I didn't want to abandon it. That next night, around midnight, a single customer came by. He needed a shave. I tried to act normal. I joked with him about the late hour, and he said he was passing through town. He didn't notice anything weird about the place, so I relaxed a bit. After he left, I stood at my station, cleaning up the loose hair. I avoided eye contact with the mirror, but the urge to check grew stronger. Finally, I looked. I saw my face, but for a moment I thought I caught a flicker of that older face. My heart gave a hard thump. Then it was gone. I took a step back and inhaled slowly. My brain felt like it was on high alert, scanning for the smallest movement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I could hear my own breathing echo in my ears. A faint drip came from the sink, so I tightened the faucet. Every noise felt amplified. Hours passed without the mirror changing again. I sat in the waiting area, crossing and uncrossing my legs, tapping my foot. I drank too much coffee. My stomach churned. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. Around 3, I heard a squeak from the barber chair. I froze. The chair hadn't moved on its own before. I walked over and inspected it. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt a chill in the air. I looked in the mirror. The older man's face returned. My chest tightened again. I clenched my fists. He was just watching me, not tapping, not moving his mouth. My reflection was nowhere to be found. I only saw him. I found myself stepping closer, even though every muscle in my body tensed up. I stared at him. He stared back. I could see the lines in his forehead, the twitch in his left eye, and the stubble on his chin. I wanted to speak to him, but I didn't know what to say. I wanted to ask him why he was there, but my voice caught in my throat. My mind felt blank except for a strong rush of fear. Then, without warning, he lifted his hand and pressed his fingers to the glass. I felt my pulse hammering in my wrists. He lifted his other hand and placed it on the glass too. My reflection's seat was absent. He was standing in my place. Then, in a jarring move, he stepped back and disappeared. The mirror showed only the shop behind me. I saw my own shape again. My heart was pounding. I backed away and sat down hard on the bench. I spent the rest of that night watching the mirror from a distance. My eyes felt strained, but I stayed vigilant. Sunrise came slowly. When light finally washed over the front windows, the older man didn't appear again. My relief was temporary. Each night I returned to the barbershop, and each night I braced myself. Sometimes the reflection is normal. Other times, I catch a glimpse of that older face or a slight delay in my movements. I can't predict when it happens. I've tried covering the mirror, but I still hear tapping or scraping. I've considered shutting down the shop, but I put too much money into this place. It's mine. I'm not ready to walk away. So I keep the doors open, waiting for the occasional customer, trying to ignore the things I see in that mirror after midnight. Every time I lock up in the morning, I exhale a shaky breath and try to tell myself it's all in my head. But each night, I step inside again, waiting for sunrise, waiting to see if he's there. And every time he appears, I feel my lungs tighten, my hands sweat, and my stomach clench because I know I can't explain it and I can't stop it. I just watch him and he watches me, and that's how it goes until dawn. I never thought an old inn on a deserted back road would make sense, but that's exactly what I bought. My friends kept telling me I should invest in a rural tourist spot, and I finally caved. The first time I arrived, I was struck by the dry heat and the silence on the empty roads. I remember stepping out of my truck, feeling my shirt stick to my back, and wondering if I had made a huge mistake. Every night since then, I've felt like someone was watching me. And every single time I look outside, I see that crouched figure near the light post. I can't see its face. It doesn't run. It just vanishes the moment I decide to go out and confront it. By morning, I find deep footprints in the mud, but they never lead anywhere. I moved in about a month ago. The place has 4 guest rooms in the main building, plus a small shack out back for supplies. I keep my truck parked near the front steps. There's a cracked sign by the road with the inn's name in faded letters. When I first arrived, I tried to fix the loose boards on the porch. They creaked under my weight, and a few nails were bent out of shape. I ended up pulling them out with an old crowbar that I found in a closet. The front door squeaks whenever it opens. I keep meaning to oil the hinges, but I forget most days. Right now, I have bigger things on my mind. During the day, the air is still. There's a single paved road that runs along the property, but hardly anyone ever passes. Once in a while, an old pickup rattles by. I tried to count the number of cars that showed up in a week, and I only got 4. Most folks around here don't wander unless they're traveling to another town or they live nearby. I've spoken to a few neighbors, but nearby means a few kilometers away. People here don't visit each other often. That first week, I woke up around midnight because the wind slammed a shutter. I sat up in bed, rubbed my eyes, and felt the sweat on my forehead. The nights are hot and still, but sometimes a sudden gust blows through. I got out of bed, turned on a lamp, and looked out the window. The property is surrounded by tall weeds and a few scraggly trees. The only light out front comes from a single lamppost, which is old and flickers a bit. Under that lamp, I noticed a shape. At first I thought it was a stray dog because it was crouched low, but then I realized it was a person. They looked folded over, as if they were hugging their knees. Their head was tilted. They seemed to be staring at me, even though I couldn't see any eyes or face. The darkness around them was thick, and the lamp didn't illuminate much besides a rough outline. My heart pounded. My throat went dry. I stood there trying to figure out what to do. I waited by the window for a minute or two, but the figure didn't move. Finally, I stepped away, grabbed my flashlight, and decided to go outside. I didn't feel brave. My legs felt weak, and my hand shook on the doorknob, but I couldn't ignore that. When I opened the door, the hinge squeaked, and a slight breeze blew against my face. I pointed the flashlight toward the post. The figure was gone. The patch of ground below the lamp was empty. There were no footprints that I could see at first glance. I walked out a bit farther and scanned the area. Nothing. There was only the soft hum of the lamp's electrical buzz. My heart pounded in my ears. I swallowed hard and felt my pulse in my throat. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a heavy chair against it. In the morning, I stepped outside and decided to check the ground again. There had been a light drizzle before sunrise, so the dirt was soft. Sure enough, I found footprints deeper than mine, pressed into the wet mud near the post. It looked like the person had been standing or crouching in the same spot all night, but there was no clear path leading away. It was as if someone had jumped and landed there, then vanished. That second night, the same thing happened. I was in the small living room after dinner, checking the few supplies I had. I remember checking my watch and seeing that it was past 11. The wind was blowing outside. The shutters rattled and the trees rustled in the distance. I got up and turned out the light, thinking maybe I'd see stars if I went to the porch. I opened the front door, and right away, I saw the figure again under the lamp. My stomach dropped. My scalp tingled. It felt like tiny sparks ran up my spine. I didn't move. I just stared. Whoever it was crouched there, head angled toward me. I couldn't see eyes or a mouth. The lamp's glow was weak, flickering, and it kept the person's face in shadow. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, and my breathing became shallow. The air felt thicker. I tried calling out, "Hello?" My voice cracked and I coughed a bit. I never heard a reply. I slowly stepped off the porch, aiming the flashlight again, but the figure was gone in a blink. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. No sound of running, no footsteps in the gravel. I ran over to the lamp, shining the flashlight in every direction. There was nothing but tall grass and a faint breeze. I didn't sleep much that night. In the following days, I focused on fixing up the inn. I patched a few holes in the roof, replaced a broken window in one of the guest rooms, and tried to air out a musty closet. I kept busy from sunrise to late afternoon, sweating like crazy in the heat. My shirt stuck to my back all day and my throat burned from thirst. I drank a lot of water but still felt dehydrated. Sometimes I heard the wind whistle through gaps in the walls. Sometimes I heard the distant rumble of an old truck passing by. But most of the time it was just quiet. At night, I stayed alert. I told myself I'd catch whoever was messing with me. I set up a small chair near the front window so I could watch the lamppost. I used a lantern and turned off the main lights in the room, hoping to stay hidden. I sat there with my knees bouncing, heart pounding whenever the wind blew. After a while, I started to feel stupid. I thought maybe it was all in my head. But around midnight, I saw movement. My heart jumped, and I gripped the windowsill so tight that my knuckles hurt. The figure appeared, hunched under the lamp. Even from the window, I could sense its stare. The hair on my arm stood up. My forehead was damp with sweat. My breathing turned shallow again. I forced myself to get up, but the moment I grabbed the doorknob, I heard a rustle. I looked back, and the figure was gone. Gone without a sound. I started to worry about my own sanity. During the day, I found more footprints outside, always in that same spot. Some nights I woke up covered in sweat, convinced I heard scratching at the window. I'd rush over, yank the curtain aside, and see nothing. Then I'd check the porch, check the lamppost, check around the bushes. I'd never see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there watching me. My stomach turned to knots every evening. My hands trembled when I locked the doors. I felt like an idiot, locking myself in. It's a small town, not exactly known for crime, and the roads are empty. But it was the only way I could rest. On the 10th day, I drove to a small hardware store about 20 kilometers away. The road was dusty, and my truck rattled a lot. When I got there, I picked up some motion sensor lights and an extra padlock for the storage shed. The place was run by a guy named Teodoro. He noticed I looked tired and asked if I was all right. I shrugged and said I was just adjusting to rural life. I didn't want to explain the figure. It sounded ridiculous. I paid for my stuff and drove back. That evening, I installed the motion sensor lights around the yard. It took me a while because I'm not great with wiring. I only got them partly set up before sunset. Then I walked out to the lamp post and checked the base. I found a few chips in the cement and some rust on the metal. I placed a sensor light near it, pointed toward the house. My plan was to see if it triggered when the figure showed up. By midnight, I was exhausted. My back ached from working. My legs felt stiff. I collapsed into a chair by the window, munching on a piece of bread and sipping water. It was pitch black outside except for the lamppost and the faint glow of the moon. The motion sensor lights were off, waiting to detect movement. I almost dozed off, but a flicker caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was there again, crouched under the post. I waited for the motion sensor to kick in. It didn't. The figure just knelt there, staring. My chest tightened and my palms were clammy. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I stood up, walked to the front door, and stepped onto the porch. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. I clicked on my flashlight. The figure stayed in place for a second. Then, as I aimed the beam directly, it vanished. In that exact instant, the motion sensor light flicked on, flooding the area with bright white light. I ran down the steps and scanned every angle. Nothing. I felt the tension in my shoulders. The only sound was the buzz of the sensor light. I circled the lamppost looking for footprints. I saw the same deep impressions in the dirt. They looked fresh, but there was no pattern leading away. I kicked the dirt in frustration. It felt sticky from the slight humidity. I looked up at the stars, trying to calm my breathing. Eventually, I went back inside. Later that week, I tried setting up a camera by the window. It was an old digital camera I'd used for vacations. I put it on a tripod, aimed it at the lamppost, and pressed record. I sat next to it for hours. My eyelids grew heavy, and I fought to stay awake. Around 2 in the morning, I snapped out of a light doze and checked the footage. I rewound it a bit and saw the faint shape of the figure for only a moment. Then it vanished. The camera didn't pick up any details. Just a dark blob that seemed to kneel in the shadows. I decided to approach a local after that, someone who might know the history of the area. I found an older man named Geraldo in a nearby house. He was friendly enough, but when I asked if he'd ever seen someone on the roads at night, he just shrugged. He said people around here mind their own business. He mentioned that sometimes drifters pass by, but they usually knock on doors or ask for a ride. I asked about footprints that lead nowhere. He shrugged again. I couldn't tell if he was hiding something or if he just thought I was imagining things. He offered me a small cup of coffee, and we chatted about the weather and the dryness. Then I drove back to the inn. Now it's been over a month, and the nightly visits haven't stopped. Every single night, around the same time, I see that shape under the light. When I open the door, it disappears. During the day, I check the dirt and always find those footprints. Sometimes I feel a chill in the air despite the heat. My appetite is gone most days, and I'm tired from lack of proper sleep. I've started to question my decision to stay here. The inn isn't ready for guests, and I'm not sure it ever will be if this keeps up. I'm sitting in the kitchen right now, writing this down to keep my head straight. The wooden chair is uncomfortable, and I can hear the old fridge humming in the background. My eyes drift to the clock on the wall every few minutes. It's almost midnight. The windows are closed, and I locked the front door. I can still see the lamppost through the small window over the sink. The light flickers sometimes, sending faint shadows across the yard. My hands feel shaky. I can sense a twist in my gut. The night air outside is dead silent. Not even a breeze rustles the bushes. My mind is stuck on the image of that crouched figure. I remember its posture, the way it seems to stare even without a visible face. I can't think of a reasonable explanation. I don't talk about it with anyone because I don't think they'd believe me. But I know what I see. I know the footprints are real. I tried calling my friends, the ones who convinced me to buy this place. They told me to hire a guard or install better fences. That isn't so easy here. The land is wide, and I'm already stretched thin with expenses. I can't afford a full security system. And even if I did, I'm not sure it would stop whatever is happening. I wonder if I'll ever get used to this. I wonder if I'll ever see the figure's face. Part of me wants to give up and leave, but then I think of the money I've put into this place. I've got too much pride to abandon it now. I turn off the kitchen light. I move to the window, pressing my face close to the glass. The lamppost stands about 30 feet away, illuminating a patch of dirt and gravel. My breath fogs the window a little. The house is quiet except for the soft hum of the fridge. I blink and check the time again. Midnight is here. The scene outside is empty, but I don't trust it. My pulse is steady but firm. My palms feel damp. My skin prickles on the back of my neck. I keep my eyes on that spot under the lamp, waiting for the shape to appear. Suddenly, there's a flicker in the light. My chest tightens. I see movement. There it is again, crouched and silent. My heart pounds so hard I can feel it in my ears. My throat goes dry. I consider opening the door, but my knees feel weak. I stand there, stuck between fear and curiosity. I squeeze the windowsill. The figure doesn't budge. It just stays there, folded at the knees, as if it's waiting for me. My breath comes in shallow bursts. My mind goes blank except for one single thought. I have to see who or what that is. I force myself to move away from the window. I walk toward the front door, feeling my legs shake. I rest a hand on the doorknob, but I don't turn it. I catch a glimpse of my reflection in the door's glass panel. My eyes look tired. My hair is a mess. My skin is pale. I hold my breath, twist the knob, and open the door just enough to peek outside. The figure is gone. Just like that. The motion sensor light flicks on again, covering the yard with bright light. I step onto the porch and scan the area. The wind picks up, brushing my face with hot air. The lamppost hums. The yard is empty. A low rustling sound comes from the weeds. I walk forward, checking the ground. The footprints are there again, pressed into the soft dirt, leading nowhere. I stand there sweating, heart racing, and I feel the hopelessness of the situation. I can't chase a phantom. I can't shoot at a shadow. I can't sell this place easily because nobody wants a rundown inn with a bizarre nighttime visitor. So I go back inside, slam the door behind me, and lock it. I collapse into a chair in the living room, feeling my heartbeat slow down bit by bit. The night drags on, and I know I won't sleep well. Tomorrow, I'll see those footprints again, and I'll probably tear my hair out trying to understand them. But for now, I just sit there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, wondering how long I can keep this up.